Themed question time. The next item of business this afternoon is a continuation of the debate on the Scottish Government's programme, and I would now invite members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons, but also advise members if you are thinking of speaking as in questions, please put your microphones up if you know you are going to be speaking in a debate. I will call on the first speaker this afternoon when she is ready to speak in this debate, Cabinet Secretary Nicola Sturgeon.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. You know it's been a long parliamentary debate when you start it in one government job and end it in another government job. Presiding Officer, let me take the opportunity, since it's available to me, just to say a few words about the government changes confirmed by the First Minister earlier today. The first thing I want to say from the bottom of my heart is that it has been an extraordinary privilege to serve as Scotland's Health Secretary over these past 5 years. I'm very proud of what has been achieved in those 5 years in what have been extremely challenging times. We have the lowest waiting times on record. We have the lowest hospital infection rates on record. We have patient care that is safer than it has ever been before. And I'm particularly proud to have steered through this Parliament the groundbreaking, world-leading legislation on minimum pricing. And, Presiding Officer, I hope to see that implemented as soon as possible. I want to thank everyone that I have had the privilege of working with over these past 5 years, officials in the Scottish Government, managers in our health service, the chairs of health boards, trade unions, interest groups, but above all else, I want to thank those who work in the front line of our health service. We are so incredibly lucky in our National Health Service and in those who work in our National Health Service. And I'm particularly proud of having been able to protect not just the budget of our National Health Service, but protect the founding principles. And I know that Alex Neil will continue to do just that as he takes over as Health Secretary. Presiding Officer, I'm also extremely excited to be taking on new responsibilities in government, and the new responsibilities I take over as of today reflect very closely the twin priorities of the programme for government that the First Minister outlined yesterday, the programme for government that we debate today. I, as Cabinet Secretary for Infrastructure, Investment and Cities, will be very pleased to work with the First Minister and with John Swinney on the government's strategy for economic recovery. And in that regard, I look forward with my ministerial colleagues Keith Brown and Margaret Burgess, who I particularly welcome to her new post as Minister for Housing and Welfare. I look forward to working with both of them to pursue the procurement bill, the better regulation bill, as well as all of the other priorities. I should say, in taking on responsibility for infrastructure and investment, I have got very big boots to fill in the shape of Alex Neil. I say that only in the hope that he says the same about his predecessor in the new role that he takes over today. But, Presiding Officer, nothing can be more important at this moment in time than responding to the real pressures that individuals and families across Scotland are facing, to do everything we can within our powers and our resources to get our economy growing and to create jobs, and, Presiding Officer, to challenge as vigorously as we can the disastrous economic policy of the Tory Liberal coalition. And I repeat today the message already sent loudly and clearly by the First Minister to the UK Government. Our economy needs capital stimulus, and it needs it now. We have the shovel-ready projects. It is incumbent on the UK Government now to provide the funds, and if they care at all about the human cost of unemployment, then they will not delay in doing so. But, you know, Presiding Officer, I want to be able to do so much more than lobby an unresponsive UK government for a sane economic policy. I want to be in a government with the power to make for ourselves the decisions we need to take to get our economy growing. And that brings me to the second part of my new government responsibilities. I have believed for all of my adult life that Scotland should be an independent nation. For me, it's never really been about flags or status symbols. It's all about how we make this country of ours the best that it possibly can be. It's based on the fundamental belief that if we want a strong economy, we must have access to all of Scotland's resources, not just to that portion of Scotland's resources that the UK Government chooses to give us. It's based on the inescapable reality that if we want to tackle once and for all the scandal of child poverty, then we must be able to make our own decisions on tax and benefits. And, Presiding Officer, we must be able to prioritise spending on the early years of our children's lives over spending on weapons of mass destruction. And it's based on the irrefutable logic that if it is right, and it is right, for this Parliament to take decisions on health, education, on justice, then how can it be anything other than right for this Parliament also to take decisions on the economy, on welfare and defence? I believe passionately that the best people to take decisions about Scotland are those who live here. And, Presiding Officer, I look forward immensely with my colleagues to making that honest, that positive and that upbeat case over these next 2 years. And I look forward to winning that independence referendum in 2014.
Many, many thanks. I now call on Richard Baker to be followed by Marco Biaggi. 6 minutes or thereby, please.
Well, Presiding Officer, just as I was putting the finishing touches on this speech over lunch, so much has happened. Indeed, there appears to be rather more excitement in the lobby, and in particular on the SNP benches, over the Scottish Cabinet reshuffle and over this legislative programme, which is entirely understandable. But while I welcome Nicola Sturgeon to her new role at Infrastructure and Capital Investment, this central move of the reshuffle also reflects what is at the heart of the legislative programme announced yesterday, that at the end of the day, for the SNP, breaking up the United Kingdom is the be-all and end-all. Nicola Sturgeon has quit the health brief so she can spend more time on debating independence. Well, I can tell her that the infrastructure and capital investment brief is not only time-consuming, it is also crucial. Presiding Officer, I'd like to tell you how sorry I am to see Mr Neil move on from infrastructure and capital investment to his new role. But I think we all know that would be stretching the bounds of credibility, something which Mr Neil does himself all too often. Actually, I do wish him well. But Mr Neil's performance in his... No, I don't. But Mr Neil's performance in his former brief also speaks of where this legislative programme fails too, because while we will look forward with interest to the Sustainable Procurement Bill, the fact is that in this key area of policy, the Scottish Government's underperformance has been damaging to our economy and to key sectors, including the construction industry. When it comes to the key issue of the economy, too often we've had warm words and not the action required from the Scottish Government. Yesterday, the First Minister talked again about shovel-ready projects, but his own government has delayed a host of key infrastructure projects at a time when our construction sector is crying out for work. Mr MacDonald.
Mark MacDonald.
I'm grateful to Mr Baker for giving way. Over the summer, I wrote to Mr Baker asking him if he, as Labour's capital investment spokesperson, would back the calls from the Scottish Government for shovel-ready projects to be brought forward by the UK Government. To date, I've received no reply. Perhaps he would like to give me the answer now.
Richard Baker.
Well, I didn't get a letter, but what I would say to Mr MacDonald is, just keep trying, Mark. Eventually you'll get there. Persistence will pay off, and shan't be too disappointed about today. So, but if I don't receive the best will in the world, with my many abilities, if I don't get a letter, I really can't reply to it. So, yesterday, so we find out, in terms of the construction and capital investment that should be taking place, we find out today that on the basis of a draft report, the budget for the Edinburgh to Glasgow Rail Improvement Plan was cut by £350 million. In Aberdeen, our energy sector requires 120,000 new recruits. Where's the plan to deal with that crucial issue for the economy, not just of Aberdeen, but of Scotland? The call in the report from PricewaterhouseCoopers is for an energy academy at the same time as the SNP slash college budgets. And of course, we heard yesterday that because Aberdeen City Council won't back the First Minister's pet project, they are withdrawing support for new development in the city, and in doing so, failing Aberdeen again. In the last Parliament, we were told that the overarching purpose of this government was economic growth. And to emphasise this point, It was referred to as the purpose with a capital T and a capital P. But this debate has shown that this is a government with its eye off the ball on the economy and whose purpose now is solely separation with a capital S. We'll engage with the Sustainable Procurement Bill, but again and again, Mr Neil told us he couldn't take the action we need on procurement because of the European Union. The action we need to ensure that through the use of community benefit clauses and creating smaller contracts, we give small and medium-sized enterprises in Scotland a better chance of benefiting from public sector investment and through that growing our economy. But in fact, far from blocking such action, the EU is already proposing a directive which states contracting authorities will be encouraged to divide public contracts into lots to make them more accessible for SMEs. If they decide not to do so, they'll be obliged to provide a specific explanation. So why aren't the Scottish Government doing this already? This doesn't need a bill. And why, in fact, are they still doing the opposite and creating contracts so big that only big business can bid for them? And yesterday, the First Minister said, we will put... I'd better take it.
Alec Neil.
I thank the member for taking the intervention. Can I just point out to him and let me confuse him with some facts? 75% of all the contracts let through the Scottish Government's portal go to small and medium-sized enterprises.
Richard Baker.
Mr Neil never lets the facts get in the way or indeed confuses him. But indeed, what I'll say, I'll refer him to the Jimmy Reid Foundation report, which contradicts many of the statements he's made on procurement. Yesterday, the First Minister said we'll put community benefit clauses into every public sector contract. The question is, why hasn't that been done already? Because unfortunately, on the fourth replacement crossing, the ship sailed and Scottish firms have already lost out. We also know how important to the economy, our construction and to our construction industry new housing is. Yet the last budget slashed housing investment by £86 million, and the vaunted housing bill to take place in this programme is conspicuous by its absence. Not an auspicious record for Mr Neil to take to the Health Department. And it's not good enough to say this will all be sorted out after separation, as if that would free us from Tory government, when in fact the SNP's proposal on monetary policy is that future UK governments, of whatever political complexion, will still make key decisions on our economy with zero influence from politicians in Scotland. And in my final minute, Margot, I do apologise. Separation is their obsession, but it's no solution. And for all they say the economy is their focus, this programme of bills and the events of today show that this administration has its eye well and truly off the ball when it comes to taking the action we need to restore Scotland to growth. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, that's why we need to get beyond the process of the referendum and get on with making the decision, so that once Scotland has decided to maintain our membership of the UK, we can all get on with what we should be doing in this devolved Parliament, delivering on the priorities which really matter for the people we represent.
Thank you very much. I now call on Marco Biaggi to be followed by Jackson Carlo. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This is a programme for government that is focused on opportunities. Opportunities for Scotland, not least in ridding ourselves of the economics of Westminster, and also, hopefully, of ridding ourselves of the kind of contributions that we had yesterday from Joanne Lamont and now today from Richard Baker, which I would characterise quite politely as an ideas-free zone. It is not enough to come to this chamber and to repeatedly criticise SNP ideas with all the positivity of someone who is chewing on a wasp without suggesting what you would do as an alternative with the powers available. We are perfectly aware that there is so much you can do with the Scottish Parliament, but so much more that we could do with the full powers of independence, being a normal nation able to govern our affairs. But, yes, of course.
Liam MacArthur.
Very grateful to Marco Biaggi for taking an intervention. In the spirit of his request for ideas, would he perhaps comment on where we might be with the shovel-ready projects had ministers in the previous Parliament taken up the decision to mutualise or move Scottish Water to a public interest company, which is what John Swinney seems to be intent on doing anyway?
Marco Biaggi.
Perhaps Liam MacArthur might be able to provide the assurance that his Lib Dem colleague in the Treasury was never able to, that the UK government wouldn't take advantage of the ability to claw back all the money. You know, a privatisation of Scottish Water has enough flaws to begin with as an idea, but to suggest that it could happen and we could end up even worse off, I think is quite a ridiculous suggestion, and perhaps one of the reasons no one ever takes the Lib Dems seriously anymore. Now, I want to get on to two of the bills that are in this programme. One of them is the Post-16 bill, which sets down legal frameworks for some of the changes already in progress, such as to colleges and rest of UK student fees, but will also deliver, crucially, the whole new process of the widening access agreements for universities. Liz Smith yesterday said that the widening access debate shouldn't be restricted to universities, and certainly it should go beyond them, and it includes schools. But while I do look forward to the day when our state schools are so good, so well performing across the whole country that people look back bewildered and wonder why anybody would ever pay £21,000 to send their children anywhere else, we have to recognise that there are steps to be taken right now, extending the work that universities have been doing for many years to reach out and bring in recruits and applicants from the kind of schools that are perhaps not sending as many at the moment. No, thank you. There have been a series of steps that have already been taken. We have free higher education in Scotland. We have the highest ever support for students to deal with their living costs. And all of these steps have helped. But looking ahead, and I'll perhaps take Liz Smith in a moment, I think it's hardly revolutionary to suggest that admissions teams looking at potential applicants should consider the wider pupil, not simply how the pupil has done before, but how they may do again. It's like a job panel. You take the record and previous employment into account, but it is not the sole circumstance. The definitive study from England, 8,000 A-level students, is that an independent or grammar school pupil with 2 A's and a B at A-level performs just as well at university as a comprehensive pupil with 3 B's. No wonder. I mean, once you're at university, the state school pupil sits next to the Eton graduate and they go to the same lectures, the same seminars, and frankly, we should be seeing university as the levelling effect that it is. If, however, Liz Smith would like to explain the levelling effect of £9,000 a year tuition fees, I'm happy to take an intervention.
Liz Smith.
Thank you for taking the intervention. I don't disagree with some of what you're saying, but would you accept that in terms of Scottish universities there is huge progress, very satisfactory progress on widening access, and it's the universities themselves who have made these decisions? Perhaps we don't need legislation to do that.
Marco Biaggi.
I certainly welcome the action that has been taken by universities and welcome the progress that has been taken. And I think as long as we work in the spirit of that and spur them to go even further, we can really achieve some quite remarkable results in the future. I look forward to looking at the bill in the Education Committee. Now, the other bill I want to single out is also a landmark, and it's focused on opportunity. And although it's only going to directly affect perhaps 2% of Scotland's population, I think it is a sign of where we want to go to as a country. As I grew up, gay people were censored out of existence in schools. And when I came out, we had relatively recently won at the European Court the right to join the armed forces and an equal age of consent. Adoption rights, civil partnerships and legal protection from shops being able to put up signs saying no gays allowed were all yet to come. This far on, it's very easy to forget how bitterly all of those steps were opposed. Research just this year from the University of Cambridge finds that 54% of young Scots, that's 54%, who come out in their teens are driven to self-harm by the attitudes they hear often every day. This is not an issue that should divide religion and secular. This is a division of opinion. There are 5 congregations from faiths... You must close now, please. Okay. There are 5 congregations from in my constituency who wish to perform these marriages. This isn't the Middle Ages. It is not for the state to choose sides. And I look forward to supporting this bill so that in marital rights we don't have to sit at the back of the bus.
Thank you very much. Now call on Jackson Carlaw, to be followed by Jamie Hepburn.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. Well, we meet this afternoon in the shadow of the kerfuffle of a reshuffle of the Scottish Government. I mean, never has the reception in the short life of this Parliament to a government's programme been so lacklustre that the First Minister has felt it necessary to reshuffle his team within 24 hours of it being announced. But that, of course, is what we've seen today. And I note we are to debate the changes tomorrow afternoon. I look forward to commenting on my own way on some of the new ministerial appointments at that point. But may I, at this stage, congratulate Nicola Sturgeon on a personal level. I think she has been an effective Cabinet Secretary for Health. I thank her for the courteous way in which she has conducted business. I have previously put on record the fact that I believe she has proved herself to be an extremely capable pair of hands in a crisis. And I can therefore well understand why the First Minister has felt it necessary to move her to put her in charge of their constitutional debate, such as the mess that has been made of it over the summer. Now, this is a programme in which I think there are some very worthwhile measures. I look forward to the progress of the Adult and Social Care Integration Bill. It's got relatively few words in the programme, and I think it will prove to be a much more complicated exercise to take through Parliament and to ensure we get right than the simple title suggests. The Children and Young People Bill, the Fourth Estuary Bill, which I think seemed a sensible proposition at the point when we progressed the Fourth Crossing. The Procurement Reform Bill as well. I think the Land and Buildings Transaction Tax may prove to be a difficult measure. Any new tax is, and I'm interested to see exactly how the Government unfold the detail of that and what support they find within the wider Scottish public for it. And there is the bold, the Marriage and Civil Partnership Bill, which Nicola Sturgeon has spoken courageously on to date, and which I understand Alec Neil will take forward from here. And can I say on a personal level, subject to the provisions of that bill, I personally very much hope to be supporting it as it goes through Parliament. Yesterday, the First Minister said these were good things to do at any time. And yet, I ask the Chamber over the course of the summer, was that what the SNP's talk was full of in the briefings they gave to the media? Was this the centre of their discussion? No. It was an internal row about membership of NATO. And oh, how some of those rash heads must be regretting the bold stand they took in that issue this afternoon. It was about the future of the BBC. It was about Scolympia. It was about independence. Yesterday, on television, the Cabinet Secretary for Finance said that the government was focused on the economy. Would that it was. It's clear from the reshuffle we have this afternoon that this is a reshuffle and a government that is focused on only one question, and that question is independence at the expense of the wider debate in Scotland. The First Minister said yesterday in his remarks, the people of Scotland recognise that Scotland's referendum should be made here in Scotland. But by whom? Not with the participation of any of the leaders of the other elected representatives in this chamber who, in trying to participate in the construction of a question, have been loftily dismissed. Not by the legal establishment, who were told they were nothing other than a kangaroo court by Mr Russell. This is not a debate that is being shaped here in Scotland. This is a debate about Scolympia being shaped on Mount Scolympus. For Scolympians, by McZeus, by the SNP, by Alex Salmon, who will decide this unilaterally on behalf of the people of Scotland. The only encouraging thing the First Minister had to say yesterday on the issue was that he would be meeting the Prime Minister in a few weeks' time and would come to an agreement. Well, I hope we can come to an agreement sooner rather than later. I hope we can have the debate sooner rather than later. I hope we can have the vote sooner rather than later. And what the people of Scotland want is a debate and a vote on a single clear question, the question the SNP have a mandate to put, whether or not Scotland becomes an independent nation from the rest of the United Kingdom. I'd like to say something about health. The government's record on health is actually quite a good one. I paid tribute to Nicola Sturgeon before. I don't stand here as an opposition politician and simply say everything the government does is dreadful. I don't believe that to be true. I think that some of their decisions, sort of dismissing the outcomes of the Stracathro pilot, which I think were encouraging and perhaps offered a model, the move for free prescriptions, are decisions for which there are consequences. I think there is a fraying at the edges of the health service now with fewer nurses, and I think there are considerable challenges, notwithstanding the finance that is available to it. But it's on cancer that I would particularly like to see progress. In the document on the programme, it says the government is keen to identify cancer in advance in order to try and reduce premature mortality. Now, I know that we advanced a proposal for a cancer drugs fund, one which operates in England and which some 12,000 people had benefited from by January. I recognise, although that remains our policy, that it is not one that commands support elsewhere in the chamber. But in an era where drugs are now being developed that can potentially radically improve the chances of life on diseases that for all of our lives we hope there would one day be a cure, I will write to the new Cabinet Secretary and see whether there is an opportunity to find some common ground between the parties, to find a way in which we can embrace the introduction of new technologies to the benefit of the health of the people of Scotland.
Nicholas Sturgeon.
I'm sure the new Health Secretary will be delighted to receive his letter. I wonder if he would agree with me, though, that the biggest challenge around cancer is to get people detected much, much earlier. And in that vein, would he join with me in welcoming the groundbreaking new advertising campaign to encourage women to report earlier with symptoms of breast cancer?
Close now, please.
Absolutely. Of course I do, and I welcome that. Finally, then, just can I say, the last SNP government was a minority government that reached across the chamber. I think history will judge it more favourably than this one. This government has to be careful. It's becoming belligerent. It's showing a lack of candour. It's an inability to accept error. It's a refusal to accept advice.
And you're closing
it's becoming
now,
arrogant.
please.
There is hubris. A focus on the agenda of Scotland must take precedence over a focus on an independence agenda for Scotland.
Thank you very much. And I call on Jamie Hepburn to be followed by Ken McIntosh.
Thank you very much, President Officer. And I have to say, with all that talk of Scalympia, I think it's quite clear Jackson Carlo's been drinking Skol before starting to speak in the chamber. I'm not quite sure how to follow that performance. But I can say to my colleague Mark MacDonald, I think it is quite clear that we can identify at least one shovel-ready project that Richard Baker is willing to support, and that is, of course, that of Joanne Lamont's leadership of the Labour Party. Can I also say I'm somewhat delighted to be able to speak in this debate. I think it was interesting to see yesterday was criticism of this being somewhat of a legislation-light government programme. Well, my understanding is that in any given parliamentary year we are able to see an average of 12 bills passed in any given parliamentary year, and this is a programme of some 15 bills. And I was also interested to look at the debate last year in the 2011 programme for government debate, and I want to quote some of the participants from that time. Jackie Bailey said, what about the bold measures that could have been brought forward to deliver the better integration of health and social care, criticising the statement that time. Ian Gray said, why is there no reform of procurement? Murdo Fraser criticised the absence of an independence referendum bill, and John Lamont talked of the absence of legislation on victims' rights. Well, what do we have this year? We have an integration of adult health and social care bill. We have a procurement reform bill. We have a victims and witnesses bill. We have a referendum bill. I must have missed the welcoming of all these articles of legislation, President Officer, that have been demanded last year, that have been announced yesterday. And of course I'll give way to Jackie Bailey.
Bailey.
And let me leave him in no doubt. I do indeed welcome them, because you know where Labour where Labour lead, the SNP will follow. I know. But you absolutely know that where Labour lead, the SNP will follow.
Well, can I say, President Officer, I very much welcomed that intervention by Jackie Bailey. Can I also say I want to focus on a little more detail some of what was said in yesterday's debate before I talk of, hopefully I've got enough time to talk about some of the specific articles of legislation I particularly welcome. It was interesting yesterday to hear criticism that the NHS budget has been cut by £300 million. But of course we know that in actual fact the NHS revenue budget has been protected, and by 2014-15 we'll actually see a record £11.6 billion resource funding for health in Scotland, which is £826 million more than in last year. and that might explain why there are more people now satisfied with Scotland's health service than there were on the 2005 Scottish Social Attitude Survey under a previous administration. It was also interesting to hear the leader of the Labour Party talk about the Scottish Government policy on PE being a sham. Of course, we know that 84% of primary schools are providing 2 hours of PE per week to all pupils, which is up from the previous Labour Liberal administration. And we also see that 92% of secondary schools are providing 2 periods of PE across S1 and S4. That's actually up. That's doubled from 46% in 2004-05, the last time the survey was carried out. So I think it's important to place some facts on the record, because frankly, some of what we heard yesterday was a travesty of public debate as far as I was concerned. But can I turn to some of the specific pieces of legislation that are in this programme for government? The first one I want to talk about is, very briefly, is the Marriage and Civil Partnership Bill. Can I say I very much support the principles behind that particular piece of legislation. I think the comments that we heard from Patrick Harvey and from Willie Rennie, can I say I very much appreciated the first half of Willie Rennie's speech yesterday, not the latter part, and what we heard from Marco Biaggi today. I think their comments about this being about the freedom of religion were very well made, and I think that is something we should reflect on. And of course, we do need to see the final details of that legislation, but I do look forward to looking at it sympathetically and hopefully being able to support its passage into law. Can also, I want to look at the Children and Young People Bill, because during the recess I became a father again, and looking at my own experience of my own children makes me all the more determined to support the well-stated ambition, stated so often by my friend Aileen Campbell, to make Scotland the best country in the world to grow up. And I think that's a very noble ambition. I think it's surely one we can all support. And I think a bill that is designed to embed a new approach based on prevention, appropriate early intervention and on child-centred service delivery is surely something that we should all unite around. And I think it's a piece of legislation with its specific provisions that's particularly welcome. I think the First Minister was quite right to set out that and against the context of the UK Government's welfare reform agenda, it's all the more relevant. And also in that regard, I do look forward, I know it's not a specific part of the programme for government that was announced yesterday, but the regulations on passported benefits that the Scottish Government is bringing forward, I look forward to seeing them. They're going to be very important. I look forward to looking at them in the Welfare Reform Committee. Can also close, Presiding Officer, because the Welfare Reform agenda is also a huge part of why the referendum bill is so important as well, because of course with independence we would no longer be subject to the vagaries of an unelected Tory government with its welfare reform agenda and its austerity measures. I think it's very interesting to see a Labour Party in a Better Together campaign with a party that's taking forward that kind of agenda. And I'm sure they'll come to rue the day, and hopefully when we become independent they will apologise to the people of Scotland.
Thank you very much. Now call on Ken McIntosh to be followed by Christine Graham. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I join in the general welcome back to the new session? I hope everyone has had a good recess and an enjoyable break if they had one. I was going to say it's great to see everyone here again, but that's probably stretching it a little far. But of course, it's great to see most here, Ms Robson. And of course, the start of a new session is an opportunity for Government and Parliament alike to reaffirm our purpose, our sense of mission. It's a chance to refresh our thinking on where we are heading as a country, to look at our key policies, to think again about what we are trying to achieve, or failing that, of course, to have a reshuffle. But I do want to take this opportunity to congratulate the Cabinet Secretary, Nicola Sturgeon, her ministerial colleagues, Ant Neil, Margaret Burgess, Paul Wheelhouse, Joe Fitzpatrick and Hamza Youssef on their appointment. And can I also offer my thanks too to Stuart Stevenson, Bruce Crawford and Brian Adam for their contribution, substantial contribution to government over many years. But the start of a new session, equally importantly, it is an opportunity to make an assessment of our progress towards the goals of government. And I have to admit, when looking back at the last 5 years of the SNP administration, it's difficult for me to get a real sense of progress towards anything other than a referendum on separation. When I was out and about this summer on the doorstep, as I'm sure many colleagues here were, there is absolutely no doubt that the economy is the #1 issue in everyone's minds. I doubt there's scarcely a family in the country which has not been affected one way or another. People are worried about bills, about petrol costs, about wage freezes or cuts, about their job security or their lack of employment. Times are tough and too many people are feeling the pinch. Jobs and growth, those were the watchwords of the Finance Secretary at the last budget, and yet we're still not seeing any economic growth, and there are precious few jobs. In fact, a survey out just last week suggests that real unemployment, the actual joblessness that affects families and communities across Scotland, is far worse than official figures suggest. And even for those in employment, too many are becoming part of the working poor, stressed and struggling, but struggling to keep their heads above water. Our country is in the grip of a double-dip recession, but the only answers that the Scottish Government keep coming up with are to ask Westminster for more money or to blame the Tory Government for everything. Now, I'm not saying that there are not problems emanating from the Tory Government, but surely we can do more with the powers already at our disposal here in Scotland. The construction industry, which should be the spark to get the economy going, is in the doldrums. Yet the SNP's response in the budget last year was to cut £100 million from the housing budget. Unemployment is running at record levels. Youth unemployment in particular is a hallmark of this recession, and one which could potentially scar a whole new generation. Yet the SNP's answer was to cut college budgets by more than £70 million. And yes, of course, more capital, in answer to Mark MacDonald, more capital to spend on shovel-ready projects would be a huge help. But why are the SNP delaying their own projects, which could be shovel-ready, such as the Sick Kids in Edinburgh, or ripping hundreds of millions of pounds out of projects such as the Glasgow-Edinburgh Rail Improvement Programme? Even the programmes which are the gift of Scottish ministers, such as the Forth Crossing, could be used to better advantage in the Scottish economy. Instead, the droopy mantra that we hear repeatedly from the Scottish Government is that only independence will give us the levers of control that allow us to reshape our economy. We heard it yet again from the First Minister yesterday and from the Cabinet Secretary today, and yet again it sounds to me less like a policy and more like an excuse. When we ask...
Nigel Dawn.
Yes, Mr. Dawn.
I'm very grateful, and I am actually delighted to see everybody back from their holidays, because I'm glad we're all here. The member, as I've just heard him, has asked for 3 more expenditures of money, very commendably, and he's criticised the government for saying we'd like more money from Westminster. Given that that's where all our money comes from, what would the member like us not to spend the money on, so that we can balance the account, please?
Ken McIntosh.
Yet again, and can I just also say I also welcome Nigel Dawn back to the Chamber. I'll be more magnanimous, yes, and you too, Christine Graham. And yes, exactly. Please stop now before we get to my...
Yes, you're coming into your last minute.
Oh, thank you. The point is, Mr. Dawn frames his question. He frames his question in terms of limits of his ambition. He says the only thing we can do is ask for money from Westminster. That surely cannot be the limit of your ambition. If you were to grow the economy, you would generate more money. There are so many things to reshape the budget, but the whole point about the Scottish budget is it is not designed to grow the economy. It is designed to appease popular sentiment. It's a series of populist measures.
The member's in his last minute.
Can I suggest that asking for jam tomorrow, independence in 2 years' time, is no answers to the problems that Scottish people are facing today? But let me make it clear, Presiding Officer, there will be areas where the Labour Party will work with the SNP and the Scottish Government, for example, on preventative spend, on childcare, working to protect our NHS, to care for our elderly, and where we can, we will work with the Scottish Government. But we need to remind Scottish ministers that the difficulties and the unfairness blighting communities and families today need answers today, not the promise of jam tomorrow. We need a government driven by the need to get Scotland working again, to get people back into jobs and to make sure they're not paid poverty wages, to boost housing and construction, to get the economy firing on all cylinders, to offer childcare to those who need it, the education, skills and training to those who want it, to use the purchasing power of government to greater benefit, and to use all the powers of this government and this Parliament to build a better Scotland today. Thank you.
Many thanks. I now call Christine Graham to be followed by Mark MacDonald, up to 6 minutes.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm delighted to see you back, Mr McIntosh. Can I just say that to call this legislation light is not doing justice, in fact, to justice. The Justice Committee will know that because we've got 3 bills coming before them, and I will address those if I have time. First referred to already by Jamie McGregor, is the Victims and Witnesses Bill. And this is very important because it's support for witnesses from the point of the police investigation, and I would suggest not just through to the discharge of the prisoner if proved guilty, but even for a period thereafter. But I have this caveat. You must always remember that the victim is the alleged victim and will be the prime witness until the case is proved beyond reasonable doubt by the Crown with a presumption of innocence. And sometimes we are sloppy in the use of language, and we must always be wary of that. But there is no doubt, when people take the trouble to report to the police and end up in the court process, they become bewildered. They have no idea what plea bargaining is. There's whispering going down at the desk in front of the sheriff, and somehow the case is discharged. They don't know what's happened. They don't know what the disposal is. This is still happening despite years of changing it. Sometimes in the court process, they have no idea at the end what the disposal is. The sheriff says something, they come out, they don't know what's happened. They don't know what's happened at all. And sometimes, of course, the case just does not proceed on the day they expected. All of this is very unsettling for a witness and an alleged victim. So that's very important to start dealing with this so that people feel free to come forward in the first instance to report to police and then to continue through the court process and to know thereafter that it is not an end for them. That if somebody's put in prison, they then know if they're being released and what's happening within the community. And indeed, the committee itself is going to have a debate on the role of the media in dealing with court proceedings and criminal matters, because there are concerns about people being seen on the television going in to give evidence when it would be very difficult for them in their communities. Also within that bill, very, very importantly, I think, is the suggestion of a victim surcharge, which means that the accused has to pay for the distress or loss to the victim. I think that would be quite difficult to deal with in real fact, but I think it's important that we test this out and possibly have the legislation to deal with it. But I'm now going to turn to something that for me is much more controversial, which is the Criminal Justice Bill. I think this is going to be quite controversial, certainly for me. And the first thing I want to say about Carloway is this. The Carloway recommendations were the recommendations of Lord Carloway himself. Before the Justice Committee, he made it plain these were not the committee's collective recommendations. That's the first thing to know about it. And then I have to say that I have concerns about the abolition of corroboration. Now, I know what Sandy Brindley has said from Rape Crisis, thinking that this will make prosecutions for rape much more successful. I take a divergent view from that. Because if you simply have the credibility of the accused and the credibility of the witness, the alleged victim, it's perfectly open to the defence advocate to have a rather brutal cross-examination of the alleged victim on behalf of his client. And some people will look like victims and some people won't. And some people will look like rapists and some people won't. Now, add to that, we retain majority verdicts. Just a majority verdict. Now, remember, the Crown must prove its case beyond reasonable doubt. So if you've got somebody sitting there, quite rightly, it's just credibility in a serious case like this that says, I've got a wee bit of a doubt here, then you may have many, many more acquittals or not proven verdicts. So I think the issue for me is you can't take away corroboration without looking at majority verdicts and not proven. Now, I am not prepared as a backbencher, and I make this plain now as chair of the Justice Committee, to roll over for this. The jury, if you'll forgive me saying, is well out for me on abolishing corroboration in serious cases. So we will really need to look at what has happened elsewhere, where there is no corroboration in serious cases, but there is, for instance, not just majority verdicts, but unanimous verdicts. And there is no place for not proven. So we must compare apples and apples, not apples and pears. I put that there because I think it's time we had a really good look at this, bearing in mind this was Lord Carloway's view alone, not the view of his entire committee. I don't know what their view was, but it was simply him behind it. Finally, I want to touch on, because in the last minute it's very unfair not to mention tribunals, which are very, very important at the level of mental welfare, at private rented housing. I'm glad we're going to deal with that, make them more user-friendly, because that's where a lot of people feel out of their depth and unable to deal with issues on a day-to-day matter. And I think, having said all that, surely this belies the argument that for the next year, this Parliament will not be dealing with serious issues that matter to ordinary people. We certainly shall.
Drew Smith, point of order. Can I have Drew Smith's microphone?
I'm grateful, Presiding Officer. Is it in order that so few members of the Government are in attendance for this debate, given the very serious and important concerns that the previous speaker has just been making? The First Minister appeared to be present purely for the purposes of having his photograph taken. The Deputy First Minister opened this debate and has now left us.
Well, it's not a point of order, but it does give me the opportunity to remind members it's a continuation debate, and when we come to closing speeches, members who took part in the debate ought to be in the chamber for that. I now call Mark MacDonald to be followed by Neil Finlay.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and that intervention from Drew Smith kind of makes the point I was going to make at the opening, that the Better Together contributions to this debate have been a combination of the ad hoc, the ad hom and the ad nauseam. It was kind of started yesterday by Joanne Lamont's lamentable lament, and that kind of set the tone for the debate that we've had today. And I can say to Richard Baker that he's told me not to be upset. The only thing that was upset was my digestion while listening to his speech. Apart from that, I'm perfectly chipper. Thanks very much, Mr Baker. But I believe that within this legislative programme there is much to be positive and ambitious about, and I think it's unfortunate that the Better Together parties are trying to criticise what is a very substantial legislative agenda. Indeed, if we look at the Better Regulation Bill, for example, which was rather pooh-poohed yesterday by Joanne Lamont in her speech when she suggested that nobody would look back and welcome that bill in 50 years' time. Well, that's a judgment call she has to make. She obviously isn't speaking to the business community, who I think will have welcomed the fact that the Better Regulation Bill is being brought forward, and I'm sure would have raised their eyebrows at her contribution during the course of that debate. I heard what Patrick Harvey had to say about the Better Regulation Bill and his hope that it wouldn't simply be a deregulation bill. And I think it's important, however, that the regulatory landscape has to strike a balance, and that it has to work for society, for wider society, but also for business as well, in order to ensure that they are not inhibited unnecessarily. And that's a balance that I'm sure the government will be bearing in mind as they bring that bill forward. I want to focus a little bit on this issue of capital expenditure. The government has to bring forward projects where it can, and it is restricted in doing so by the cuts which are being brought to bear on the capital budget, cuts of 30% since 2009. Now, in order to lever in that funding with no borrowing powers of our own, we are forced to request to Westminster that they release more funding in order to allow us to do so. It's not a choice that we make, Mr Macintosh, to go to Westminster and say, please give us more money. It's the only game in town as long as we are restricted in terms of the money that is available to us. And the bizarre logical gymnastics which Mr Macintosh seemed to be performing in response to the very reasonable intervention by my colleague Nigel Dawn, that somehow the limit of our ambition is to ask Westminster for more money. I'm afraid, Mr Macintosh, that is the limit of the Labour Party's ambition and the Tory ambition and the Liberal Democrat ambition for this Parliament, because if they have their way, that will continue to be the situation for this Parliament, that this Parliament will continue to have to hold out its hands and say to Westminster, please, sir, I would like some more. What we want is for this Parliament, this nation, to control its own destiny, to be able to shape its own future by taking control of powers over capital expenditure, over borrowing, over the levers of the economy, over welfare, over pensions, things which matter greatly to the people that Ken Macintosh and I represent, but which are currently not within the competences of this Parliament. I will give way to you, Mr Macintosh.
Ken Macintosh.
I would thank Mr MacDonald for giving way for an intervention. Can I just ask Mr MacDonald, what would he do with any of these powers? Would he borrow more money? Would he raise taxes or cut them? What would he do? Does he want control over the Bank of England? Does he want control of currency? I want to know what you would do with these powers. Any one of them. Any one.
Mark MacDonald.
Well, we've made it very clear that we believe in sustainable borrowing to stimulate the economy through, for example, investment in shovel-ready projects, which creates more jobs, which therefore increases your income tax take because you have more people in employment. It's a very simple economic argument, and I believe it's one that your colleagues south of the border are arguing for on a pan-UK context, so I don't understand why you have such difficulty with it in a Scottish context. But the simple point that Mr Macintosh fails to realise, and that Mr Don very neatly nailed, is that the Labour Party have stood up throughout the course of the last day and a bit, and I've been listening very carefully, listening for suggestions of where spending would be reduced in order to increase spending in their own particular pet projects and areas that they wish to see spending increased in. I've yet to hear a single suggestion. Now, it's simply not credible. As an opposition who wishes to aspire at some stage, I imagine, to come back and to be in the government, it is your responsibility to present yourself as a credible alternative. In order to present yourselves as a in order for the Labour Party to present themselves as a credible alternative, they have to therefore demonstrate that they would be able to spend the money that is currently allocated to the Scottish Government in what they would perceive as a more suitable fashion. Now, they cannot simply stand up, I will in just one second, they cannot simply stand up and say, spend more money on colleges, spend more money on housing, without consequentially saying, spend less money on this, spend less money on that. That is simply pulling the wool over the eyes of the Scottish people and assuming that there is somehow some money hidden. I don't know, maybe there is a money tree in East Renfrewshire. Maybe Mr Macintosh could take us to it later and we could harvest it and use it to pay for some of these priorities. I'll give way to Margaret
MacDonald briefly, because the member is now closing.
Very briefly, there is an alternative. We could be a parish council.
Mark MacDonald.
I am hearing those words of Tony Blair echoing in my head when he described this place. But finally, presiding officer, and the point about the referendum is the referendum ties all of this together, because only through gaining full control of the powers of our nation can we drive it forward to a better future. Can we take control of things like welfare, pensions, capital expenditure, foreign affairs, defence, things which matter fundamentally to the people who we represent. We have demonstrated over the years of this Parliament that we can run health, we can run education. There's no reason why we can't run these other things. That is why we need to be an independent Scotland.
Many thanks. I now call Neil Findlay to be followed by Claire Adamson. Up to 6 minutes.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. I'm afraid the First Minister's speech yesterday was a speech that will probably have reinforced the belief amongst a growing number of people outside this chamber that politicians and those they represent live in different worlds, because the reality of life in Scotland is not the nirvana that the First Minister attempts to portray. Contemporary Scotland is a pretty ugly place and a brutal place if you're out of work with no savings, if you're ill, if you're disabled, or you're vulnerable. It's a place where almost 1 million Scots live in relative poverty and 160,000 children in absolute poverty. And it's a place where 650,000 households are experiencing fuel poverty at the same time as the 6 big energy companies make 15 billion of profit. And the situation is getting worse with Scottish Government inaction. Don't take my word for it. Listen to Brenda Boardman, the very person who coined the term fuel poverty. This week she criticised, and I quote, the feeble, inadequate, namby-pamby approach of the Scottish Government in tackling increasing fuel poverty. And Scotland is a place where in our most deprived communities, not at the moment, in our most deprived communities, people are living almost 19 years less than those in affluent areas. It's a place where, for those in employment, wages are cut or at best frozen, conditions reduced, and rights at work threatened. And it's a place where people are going without food, as the CAB reported this week, and we see the demand for food parcels dramatically rising. I think it's a scandal that we sit here in this very comfortable building on our very generous salaries, and yet there is no national outcry, no coming together, no genuine collective effort made to bring people and parties together to concentrate our efforts on providing the most basic needs for our people, especially the provision of nutritious food. Certainly.
Kevin Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I don't disagree with anything that Mr Findlay has said, and I live in the 35th poorest data zone in Scotland, which some folk don't believe in Aberdeen. But does Mr Findlay not agree that to tackle many of the issues that he has raised, including taxation over fuel companies and various other things. We actually need the levers of power here to deal with these very things that he wants to see righted, and I also want to put to rights as well. We need those powers. We could do better. Why is he quite happy for Westminster Tory governments to control the reins of power over this very important issues?
Neil Finlay.
If Mr Stewart was correct, then why was it not amongst the First Minister's 6 big demands when he went to meet Cameron after the election? Why did he not demand that they could take action on anti-poverty issues? No, instead he prioritised what? Broadcasting to get his mug on the telly more often. And if this... Not at the moment. Oh, I couldn't bear it. And if this Parliament doesn't act on this issue, then it betrays the mandate given to it when the people supported its establishment in the first place. And the words on that mace at the front are no more than window dressing for tourists. This is Scotland's real shame, and not a word in the legislative programme will address it. In his speech, the First Minister made great claims about the economy and employment, yet in the real world, with towns and villages in my region where there are levels of youth unemployment at 30%. These are levels unseen since the 1980s. And we see 1,700 workers and many more in the supply and contractor chain threatened with the dole if the Dutch multinational Vion closes the Halls meat processing plant, not to mention the knock-on impact that would have on the agricultural industry. And I would pay credit to the Finance Secretary because he has been very active on that front. Looking back at last year's legislative programme, we were told that the government's top priority was to accelerate the recovery, boost jobs and promote economic security. It was claimed that capital investment had increased construction jobs by 11.6% compared to a 0.2% drop across the rest of the UK. Well, this year, we see Scottish construction jobs fall by 6.6%. And we see a growth in England and Wales of 1.8. And sole traders, small businessmen, joiners, painters, roofing contractors, many of whom I worked with previously, tell me that they've never seen the construction industry so bad. And this is the reality of the world out there. And we hear the First Minister tell us that he's creating demand by freezing council tax. But the hard facts are that 27,500 public sector jobs have been lost and a centrally imposed tax freeze is exacerbating service decline. And if you're one of those redundant workers who can't spend money on food, clothing or services, what demand are you fulfilling? And how does a strategy of mass public sector job loss square with the stated priority of providing economic security? We're told that there will be a continuation of a no compulsory redundancy policy in the NHS and Scottish Government, yet nurses and civil servants are flying out the door. If the government's so serious about no compulsory redundancies, then let this chamber legislate for it.
Could you come to a conclusion, please?
In procurement, Patrick Harvey raised the issue of tax avoidance, and I think we really have to come back to that during the procurement bill. And I have to ask, why does it take a Labour MSP to introduce a member's bill on the living wage when the SNP government knows it can do it, but chooses to hide behind EU directives?
Thank you. Claire Adamson, to be followed by Paul Wheelhouse.
Officer. As one of the last speakers, it's always quite worrying to know if some of your speech will have been taken up by some other members, but it's been a very interesting debate this afternoon. I was particularly taken with Jackson Carlos Scolympia and his Mount Scolympia, which got me thinking that maybe that was a bit far from the government programme, and then I realised that Mount Olympus is a place far from here, where the fate of individuals and nations are changed at the whim of a select few elite individuals, far removed from the mere mortals whose lives they affect, and with no mandate to do so. So perhaps he was closer to the mark. So I am very excited, of course, about the referendum bill, as it gives us an opportunity to discuss and debate and engage with all of Scotland's people on the type of country we aspire to and the type of constitution that we want to live under. But, Presiding Officer, I would like to concentrate on what this government is doing and delivering for the young people in Scotland. This debate is varied in tone and content over the past 2 days, but I have listened and I'm increasingly surprised at the rewriting of history and a somewhat collected amnesia in some of the opposing benches. And I do wonder what message has been sent out to our young people, our teachers and our parents by some of the comments made in this chamber yesterday. The delivery in excess of 25,000 modern apprenticeships is a success story. 26,427 young people in modern apprenticeships in 2011 and 2012. Every one of those young people should be congratulated for their commitment and dedication and the training in order to reach their goals. In the words of Graham Smith, General Secretary of the STUC, he said of apprenticeships, "They offer a real chance of a job, a decent future, and few would argue that with 2/3 of people in work given no training by their employers, it is a good thing to at least offer them the chance to train and gain a qualification through an apprenticeship." Oh yes, please.
Neil Finlay.
Make a very serious point. Did she accept that there is a real difference between an apprenticeship and vocational training?
Claire Adamson.
Well, of course there is. But the modern apprenticeships are defined as such modern apprenticeships. But attacking the fact that young people in work are taking up this opportunity sends out a message that they are somehow a different class of apprentice, somehow undeserving of their position. We should be celebrating them. What's worse is that we're sending out a message that this opportunity is costing another young person a job, and this is simply not true. We should be celebrating all our young people taking advantage of the modern apprenticeship programme. Can I make it also clear in this chamber that the modern apprenticeship programme exists and runs under the same terms and conditions as it did under Labour and Lib Dem coalition? When Labour were in power, 49% of apprenticeships in 2006 were given to young people already in work. This is 23% in the most recent figures for 16 to 24-year-olds under this government. So to claim that somehow we're fiddling the figures or doing anything inappropriate is simply not true. Can I also say that there seems to be a bit of confusion on the Labour benches? And if I could turn to council tax in particular, mentioned by Mr Finlay today and also mentioned by Hugh Henry yesterday. Labour stood under a manifest commitment to maintain the council tax freeze. And yet Hugh Henry yesterday called into question why we have universal benefits such as council tax free, free prescriptions and free personal care. And in an aside almost in his speech, Mr Henry also made a comment that nursery pupils today would be lucky if the curriculum for excellence was being delivered when they were university students. Really, what message does this send out to our young people currently studying, preparing for their exams in curriculum for excellence, for the hard works of parents, teachers, delivering curriculum for excellence? It is fit for purpose, and we should commend our teachers and the people who are delivering this. And I wonder what message it sends out to Labour and North Lanarkshire Council, whose Education Director has committed in the press that they are going to be in a position to deliver this. And what irony to cast doubt on the delivery when Mr Henry stood in March in this Parliament on a motion to delay curriculum for excellence even further. And Mr Finlay also mentioned the rights of workers in his speech. So I would ask him, what trade union legislation did Labour reverse in their 18 years of power? This government is committed to our young people. The Children and Young People's Bill will be transformational for the young people of Scotland. They're providing £274 million to support early years, implementing curriculum for excellence, implementing a national domestic abuse delivery plan to help our most vulnerable young people, rolling out family nurse partnerships for our youngest and most vulnerable people, and introducing minimum alcohol and pricing, which will tackle some of the problems that blight our young people.
Could you come to a conclusion, please?
Westminster has delivered for us Thatcherism, deindustrialisation of Scotland, poll tax, illegal wars, nuclear weapons and the Trident replacement. But Labour seem to have written out things like the 10p tax rate, which absolutely attacked the most vulnerable and low-paid workers in our country.
Thank you. I now call Paul Wheelhouse to be followed by Margot MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I wholeheartedly commend Claire Adamson for what I thought was an excellent speech. One of the most powerful motivations for us all as parliamentarians is to secure the nation's, for the nation's children the brightest and best outcome, and to ensure they grow up in communities that are safe, secure and offer opportunities to them regardless of their backgrounds. And throughout my 19-year career prior to entering Parliament, I took a keen interest in the role of tertiary education in facilitating economic development and social mobility. We're often told that information is power, and it's absolutely true. A population that is well informed and given a good quality of education is an empowered population with empowered communities, and it's therefore crucial we focus as a Parliament on ensuring education provides opportunities to gain skills that equip the people of Scotland with both the vocational and life skills they need to succeed. It's for this reason I feel the Government's Post-16 Education Reform Bill is so important. In the form of governance, I was involved in previous life in reviewing Scotland's colleges governance, and I wholeheartedly endorse the intention of creating better links with employers, communities and stakeholders, because I think there have been weaknesses in the past across many colleges in the Scottish sector, not deliberate, but due to the structures they were working within. I can also state I was also very pleased that Borders College has been designated as a lead college within the Scottish Borders region. I know that was very warmly welcomed locally, and it's not been absorbed into a larger region. So it gives the opportunity for local stakeholders to work with their local lead college in delivering the skills that the Borders economy needs. As Marco Biaggi has outlined, widening access in the post-16 learning world is vital, and this is crucial because often, as we have to recognise, the secondary sector does not work for all pupils. We know that the traditional learning environment does not provide the right methodology and context for very many. The tertiary sector becomes crucial, therefore, to providing a second chance for achievement for their hopes and dreams. And I'm proud of the Scottish Government's commitment to 25,000 modern apprenticeships and its delivery of more than 26,000 modern apprenticeships in the last year, with all of these, as has been said before by others, being linked to an employment opportunity. I'm proud the Scottish Government is committed to a capital investment programme that includes a new campus for Kilmarnock College, a vital investment following the transfer of jobs from Kilmarnock to Fife. And I've seen for myself that the fruits of the investment in the Borders with the development of a highly successful modern apprenticeship programme in the textile sector organised by the Scottish Knitwear Group Training Association, which is already providing 100 apprenticeships within a fragile rural economy, and it's hopefully an example to others. Opportunities for all and its guarantee to those in the 16 to 19-year-old age group is a tremendous commitment to Scotland's young people, and both the appointment of Angela Constance as Minister for Youth Employment and next week's Summit on Women's Employment in partnership with STUC shows the importance the Scottish Government is placing on unemployment among young people and women, with both groups being so adversely impacted upon by the UK Government's austerity programme and welfare reform. Indeed, maybe to disappoint Ken McIntosh slightly, if I may refer to issues related to independence, the austerity programme, the lack of action on capital investment, something that the Labour Party identified as one of its key means by which we could tackle the economic decline, is something that is very important and can be addressed through constitutional reform. Cuts to services impacting on Scotland's budget as well are something that we can address through constitutional reform. Welfare reform and impact on children and vulnerable groups, particularly disabled, veterans, low-income families, young people. These are clearly things which can be addressed through constitutional reform. I'll give way.
Thank you, Mr Wheelhouse, for giving way. Could you just ask Mr Wheelhouse, if in this independent Scotland we adopt the Bank of England as the lender of last resort, and it sets the borrowing requirements for Scotland, how can we borrow more than is currently being given to us by the UK Government?
Paul Wheelhouse.
Well, in terms of the powers, I think it's extraordinary for Ken McIntosh to talk about the issue of the Bank of England when currently we have absolutely no say in the monetary policy of the Bank of England and indeed the interest rates that apply in Scotland. So we are talking about a situation where we have enhanced powers and we have more say in terms of the interest rates that are set in the UK. But if I can move on in terms of...
Anything's more than nothing.
Indeed, my colleague is saying anything's more than nothing. That's quite true. And in terms of education, there are clearly differences which are emerging in terms of policy both within Scotland and the rest of the UK. There's a clear water emerging between the approach taken in Scotland, which is about access to education based on the ability to learn, not the ability to pay. Ken McIntosh and others have referred to college budgets, but indeed he seemed to have a lack of humility about the position where colleges in the rest of the UK are suffering reduction in budget of more than 7% greater reduction than there is in Scotland. And if the Scottish Government had passed on Barnett consequentials in full, I'm sure they'd been criticising us for that, but actually the Scottish Government has made a smaller reduction in college budgets and is doing everything it can to sustain capital expenditure in the college sector through NPD finance. In England, we have £9,000 per annum fees for English domiciles. In Scotland, we have £0 per annum fees for Scottish domiciles. And we have a commitment to a minimum student income. And I think these are things that I would have expected a party such as the Labour Party, believing in social democracy, that they would have supported strongly. And I'm conscious of time passing, but I just want to say in terms of the independence referendum itself, that we have to lift ourselves out of this the debate that characterised yesterday, where I felt we dug ourselves into a hole where there was infighting between the party groups in here, and look at actually what the benefits can bring of constitutional reform, and really looking for the Labour Party and others who claim to believe in Home Rule to provide an alternative to the dire message that they produced yesterday. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I now call Margaret MacDonald to be followed by Bob Doris, up to 6 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Christine Graham showed why we should not talk all the time about the referendum. She talked about serious stuff that has to be tackled now. And by the way, Lord Carloway, in my opinion, was wrong, and Christine Graham is right about corroboration. But that's only one bill. There are umpteen bills in there which do require our attention, which people outside here who are not just living for every wee discussion and devolution that they pick up, they're fed up hearing it. They want to know what's going to happen because there's so much pressure in their lives and they fear so much for their children's future. So we get on with what we can do and make the best job of it and reserve a space to discuss what might be. For example, Ken McIntosh, who gave a very, very thoughtful speech, I thought, he suddenly bobs up and asks Paul Wheelhouse what he's going to do with the Bank of England. Nothing, because if we are independent, we will not have a currency that's the English currency. We will not have the Bank of England determine our rates of borrowing. I think we should have something called the Scottish dollar, because it will be a petrol currency. It will be serious, and it will be controlled in the interest of Scots, in Scotland, by Scots.
Neil Findlay.
I wonder, in the same vein, whether she's maybe had a discussion with Mr Russell on the government front bench, who thinks we should have the ducat. Where I come from, a ducat is somewhere you keep your pigeons. However, Mr Russell has a different view. I wonder what you think that would be as a currency.
Ms MacDonald, before I call you again, can I ask the front bench in front of you to take their conversations outside? Thank you very much. Margaret MacDonald.
Who is it that's speaking, I wonder? Was it a ducat? Was that what? I think it would be a ducat he would want. I think that was a medieval coin. And if we decide in that, well, fair enough. But I'll go for the dollar. It's a bit more modern and it shows intention to mix it in today's world. But what we did was we took this debate that was meant to be about the government's economic programme and we allowed it to be overshadowed by the referendum. Now, it's going to be very difficult not to have that because there's a parallel argument runs alongside everything that the likes of John Swinney does when he produces his spending plans. Although I see that the government economic strategy is due to be published later this month, and what I hope it does is separate the reality from what each side in the referendum is promoting, because that is what is confusing people, I think, outside this building. We shouldn't kid ourselves that they have a clear notion of where the demarcation lines between devolution and independence or sovereignty lie. They're not sure about these things, and we have to explain them. And it's not fair to take up the time that should be spent attacking the problems of poverty that folk are experiencing now. Now, we cannot, we know, do all of it on our own. We know that. We know it's impossible. Joanne Lamont's far too honest a woman to try and make out that it can be done in this chamber. And if you read what she said yesterday, she was concerned that we didn't do as much as we could do with the limited powers we've got. Now, I'm with her in that. That's what we should be doing. But we shouldn't be kidding on that that amounts to the best we can do. We can do very much better than that. And if we can't, it means that the people who live in Joanne Lamont's constituency are thrilled to a life of misery, dying earlier than anybody else, their children having worse health records than anybody else, just the worst social stats in the United Kingdom. That's the record of the Union as far as the people living in her constituency are concerned. And she cannot on her own, using the powers of this place, reverse that. And she wants to, and I want to help her, because I think it's my fight as much as hers. And we have failed to fight, we've failed to stand up for these people through the British system. And that's why I was very sarcastic about the Better Together and the Better Britain and so on. You have to prove that. If the SNP is being asked to prove the case for independence, then the people who support the Union must prove the case for the Union being a better option, because we have the present record to judge it by, and it doesn't come out looking very well. And Jackson Carlow knows that perfectly well. Not in any count does it come out, either social policy or economic policy. I'm giving him the chance to get up and correct me and tell me how it is.
He's looking at you lovingly.
1 minute left.
You're safe.
Ken McIntosh.
Ask Mark MacDonald, was the NHS a creation of the Union or a creation of Scotland? It's a creation of all of us.
Margaret MacDonald.
And a benefit to all of us.
That was then and now's now. Oh. Look, I give full credit to the people who created the NHS. I can quite see how after 2 world wars and the privation that they had really at the end of the Industrial Revolution, I can quite see why you would have a coming together of interests, working class interests, poor people's interests across the whole kingdom. I can quite see that. But we've now reached the stage where the interests of these groups are being denied the best possible remedy because we've allowed the institution to become something of a false god.
I must ask you to come to a conclusion.
Ken McIntosh and I must discuss much more of this much later.
Thank you very much. Bob Doris, to be followed by James Kelly.
Presiding Officer, it's a pleasure to take part in this debate, and I think I'd quite like to help the Labour Party out, because I thought the job of an opposition party was to scrutinise the legislative programme. They've singularly failed to do that at any point over the last 2 days. I think I might actually talk about the legislative programme before us, unlike the Labour Party, who have actually been more obsessed by the Constitution in this debate than the SNP has, and I think that's actually quite remarkable. So, in terms of the 15 pieces of legislation that we have before us in this session, I want to first of all look at the Children and Young People's Bill. I welcome this bill, and in particular how it will build on the 20% increase in nursery provision that has been delivered for 3- and 4-year-olds since 2007. The bill will guarantee a statutory minimum of 600 hours of childcare, and this will mean a 50% increase in nursery provision since 2007, and that will be a remarkable growth in that provision that we should all welcome. So that's something that we should all support. However, some people have said that there may not be a need for legislation, and that's been an accusation that's been levelled. But I believe it's because childcare for parents must be practical and it must be flexible to maximise the benefit to parents, to children and to our economy, that we have to legislate to make sure that when local authorities do deliver that provision, that they actually meet their responsibilities in terms of that flexible childcare. And that's why I believe legislation is necessary. I will therefore follow closely this aspect of the bill to see how the Scottish Government will legislate to ensure that such flexible provision will be offered to our communities. I also welcome the move to include vulnerable 2-year-olds within the gambit of such provision. And Labour were actually shamefully disparaging of this move and actually demanded more provision without, of course, highlighting how any additional provision would be funded. That's just not up to the job of opposition to do that. I strongly believe that expanding early years provision is the right thing to do, and the Scottish Government's move to provide childcare for vulnerable 2-year-olds should be welcome. And yes, of course, it can be built on. I'd be keen to know if there's any prospect of the £18 million announced for families yesterday from the Early Years Change Fund can be used to extend early years childcare further for 2-year-olds in some areas of the country. There is also another avenue open to the Scottish Government in terms of identifying a potential funding stream, and that is to consider using some of the European structural funds for the period 2014 to 2020 to help deliver additional care for 2-year-olds, if we so chose to do so. I would be keen to see this piloted in a small amount of deprived areas in Scotland, and I can think of areas in North Glasgow that would be ideal for such a pilot. I fully accept that the lion's share of such funds are likely to go to attempts to boost employment and infrastructure in difficult financial times, but a long-term approach to early years investment could also be part of any pot of cash that is spent between 2014 and 2020. So I welcome the Children and Young People's Bill, including, as part of its provisions, making a new order for kinship care, which I think is important, and I will follow the progress of this bill and scrutinise it through the Parliament carefully, seeing as the Labour Party quite genuinely don't seem capable of doing so. I also welcome the integration of adult health and social care bill, which I believe is essential to break down the barriers to integrated provision that is often spoken about but not always acted upon. These barriers are often budgetary in nature, and I'll come back to that in a second, and they're often cultural. It's vital that the public money that is used to support our ageing population is used to keep people happy and healthy in our communities and in their homes for longer. Issues around when older people are discharged from hospital, or indeed being discharged early from hospital, need to be addressed. Is there cost shunting going on from time to time? Many people think so, that cost shunting between local authorities and health boards. The money that it costs to look after an older person in hospital, at home or in a residential care facility should ideally come from the same budget, and both services and budgets should be seamlessly integrated. Under this legislation, that will happen. Of course, community health partnerships were supposed to take this forward, but despite some efforts that have been made, cultural resistance also, progress has been slow. Placing such integration on a statutory footing is vital to drive change, with Scotland's over 65 population set to rise by 62% by 2031, and the cost of health and social care predicted to rise over the next 20 years by another £2.5 billion. It is important that integration happens, and happens very soon. There is no other option. I am genuinely disappointed to say that in Glasgow, when the ruling administration looked at health and social care integration just last week, they were seethingly negative in relation to it, and they actually identified two aspects of it that they didn't particularly like, and that was integrated budgets and accountable officers in charge of the money. They were shying away from that, two things that are fundamental to making integration of health and social care work, and actually something that Jackie Baillie, as Labour health spokesperson in this chamber, agrees with the Scottish Government on. I would ask Ms Baillie and her National Labour Party figures to perhaps have a word with Glasgow City Council, because we need them to be on side for health and social care integration, or they let the constituents that I represent in Glasgow down. It's simply not good enough. So,
please come to a conclusion.
Over this legislative programme, can we have some positive and constructive scrutiny of the Scottish Government's programme for government? If Labour can't provide it, I'm happy to do so, and Labour should really reflect on their attitude in the last 2 days. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Many thanks. I now call James Kelly to be followed by Maureen Watt.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to take part in this afternoon's debate. There is no doubt that after all the hype and spin of the weekend, that the programme that has been brought before us is a triumph of process rather than progress. No one in the Parliament will disagree with a programme that introduces better measures for procurement, that improves the bankruptcy process and stands up for the victims of crime. But this programme fails to look at the substantive issues on the ground. As Margot MacDonald identified, what does it say out to the people in the country, to the young people in my constituency who have been unemployed for 6 months or more, to the family who stay in a house that is overcrowded and are not able to get a suitable accommodation, and to the pensioner whose appointment has been stuck in the bureaucracy of the health service. The answer from many of the SNP speakers over the last couple of days is, give us independence, take us to the land of milk and honey, and everything will be okay. And look at the process of the referendum bill. The SNP have been in power for 5 years, and it's taken 5 years to bring a draft bill to the Parliament. And then we hear that it's going to be 2 years before we actually get any vote on independence. So where are all the zealots? Where are all the conviction politicians? Where are the principled nationalists? It appears to me that the brave hearts on the SNP benches are bottling it. I give way to Mr MacDonald.
Mark MacDonald.
I'm interested that Mr Kelly seems upset that the referendum bill has taken so long to bring in, given that his party has continually said that we should be focusing on government before the Constitution. Surely that's a logical non sequitur.
James Kelly.
We have consistently said since the last election that this issue must be brought forward, it must be resolved in order to end all the uncertainty, and the sooner that happens, the better. In terms of the priorities on the ground for the people of Scotland, there's no doubt that there are real concerns out in people's communities and constituencies, because families are £1,200 worse off than they were the previous year. Long-term youth unemployment has increased by 270%, and it's not a matter to chuckle at, Mr MacDonald. And calls on housing, calls to housing charities have gone up recently by 40%. In my own constituency, in Rutherglen and Cambuslang Housing Association, people on the waiting list there face an 18-year wait. And yet, the housing budget has been cut by £100 million. Surely, not at this time, surely there is an example where a particular portfolio area and an area of the economy can be drawn together to make a real difference, because 12,000 workers have lost their jobs in the construction industry. And surely if we had more investment in housing, then we not only would provide jobs for those construction workers, but we would provide more housing for those in my constituency who are struggling to find adequate housing. I give way to Margot MacDonald.
Margot MacDonald.
Thank the member for giving way. And I absolutely agree with what he's saying just now. But there is a difficulty. For example, in Edinburgh, there's a whole scheme waiting to be rolled out to preserve the old buildings and to create new stonemasons jobs and so on. And I tried to get more apprentices. Nobody wants them. So what do we do about that? That there aren't the people with the skills or wanting to have the skills coming forward to fill these jobs.
James Kelly.
I think we need a proper apprenticeship programme to be brought forward by the Scottish Government to address those issues. Now let me deal specifically with some of the points that have been raised on the SNP benches about how such programmes could be funded in terms of the £100 million cut to the housing budget. Because let's be clear, there's a lot of money being wasted by this government. We saw only recently from Audit Scotland £133 million wasted in IT systems where the projects had to be brought to an early close. And we also saw during the summer £2.6 million being spent by the NHS on spin doctors. And that included, by the way, £500,000 in NHS Lothians. What a great success that was. Not. So I think the priority in terms of the legislative programme is to look at the budget bill coming before the Parliament in the months ahead and to identify, use these armies of civil servants that the new ministers have got, use these armies of civil servants to identify where the monies have been wasted and bring forward a proper programme that will address the needs of people of the country, look at issues like youth unemployment, tackle the housing crisis and make a real difference to the people of Scotland.
Thank you very much. Just before I call Maureen Watt, can I advise the Chamber that as Maureen Watt is the final backbench speaker, unless prior notification has been given to the presiding officer, then members who have participated in the debate over the 2 days ought to be present in the Chamber for closing speeches. Thank you very much. Maureen Watt.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I'm delighted to be speaking in this debate and to have listened to all the contributions. And what I cannot understand, bar a few, is the negativity of the speakers on the benches on both sides of us. The Labour speakers have tried to convince themselves that the SNP government has done nothing and will do nothing and concentrate only on the referendum and securing independence. I would politely suggest that the obsession with independence is with the opposition parties who raise it in this chamber more often than it is from these benches. So let me remind them of just a few of the achievements of the SNP government. In justice, most adults rate their neighbourhood as a very good place to live in, continuing a rising trend. And this has in no way been successful because of maintaining 1,000 extra police officers and leading to the lowest level of crime since 1975. In health, the majority of people, a rise of 16% since 2005, people believe that they're either very satisfied or quite satisfied with the way the NHS runs. A record 4 million people registered with NHS dentists, including 99% of 6 to 12-year-olds. A real achievement and very welcome, especially in the North East, given the shambles in this area that we inherited from the previous coalition Labour-Lib Dem government. In housing, the government exceeded its target to deliver 6,000 affordable houses. In 2011-12, it was 6,882. In education, a record high number of school leavers qualified to at least standard grade level. A record high number of school leavers in positive destinations. A record 22,292 young Scots will go to university in Scotland this year. And Scotland is one of only 3 European countries to increase investment in higher education. On the environment, continued investment in making Scotland greener and our agricultural sector providing food and drink so that these exports are also at an all-time high. The concentration on early intervention and preventative spend is making a real difference to many families, and the programme announced by the First Minister yesterday will continue to make Scotland safer, healthier, smarter and greener. So maybe the Labour Party don't like to hear this progress, but the public do. Let me remind them of the most recent poll ratings. SNP 47%, up 2%, Labour 32%, no change. 71% trust the Scottish Government to act in Scotland's best interests. Even in the present economic climate, business confidence in Scotland is the highest in the UK. It used to be if Scotland caught a cold in recessionary times, if England caught a cold in recessionary times, Scotland got the flu. The shift of money that John Swinney made to capital spend made a real difference, and that is why it's so important that money is released from the UK government for shovel-ready projects. But this business confidence and other confidence among Scots doesn't automatically happen. The Scottish Government is creating the conditions for Business Scotland. It comes from government, but it also comes from other organisations, like Aberdeen City and Shire Economic Forum, driving the economy of the North East. We're all judged by our actions rather than our words. So why do Labour politicians in Aberdeen do? They threaten to pull the funding from this body precisely because they're driving economic growth. And perhaps Richard Baker, who's not in the chamber at the moment, might have a word with Miss Eagle and stop her decrying an Aberdeen-based business for winning a contract in the rail industry. Just what is it that the Labour Party have against Aberdeen, which is the economic driver for Scotland and the UK? There are jobs aplenty in the oil and gas industry. Now, I'm not saying there's not much more to do. Of course there is. But at the moment, what we're doing is progress with one hand tied behind our backs. As Kevin Stewart said, how great it would be if we had both hands on the levers of power. But what do the opposition want to do? They just want to carry on with the mediocrity and chugging along, while the SNP government want drive and ambition for our country. The status quo isn't an option. We were told yesterday on the radio that, I quote, 3/4 of the pain still lies ahead, with widespread cuts to spending and benefits likely to have a bigger impact on voters' wallets than tax rises and reduced investment to date. Britain's recovery is more slow than other countries and from the financial crisis. And apart from Italy, Britain is the only one of the world's 20 biggest economies that is back in recession. And the UK, to our shame, is the 4th most unequal country in the world. Yet we have Labour in bed with the Tories to maintain this status quo and support worsening conditions for our citizens, instead of them supporting hope and ambition for Scots. Shame on you.
Thank you very much. We're now about to turn to closing speeches, but there are still members missing who participated in the debate yesterday afternoon. I'd be grateful if they were able to return to the chamber unless previously notified to the presiding officer. I call on Liam MacArthur. Mr MacArthur, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I, like others, congratulate those who have been promoted to ministerial office today, and can I also acknowledge the contributions, like Ken McIntosh, of Bruce Crawford, Brian Adam and Stuart Stevenson. I've always found each of them extremely approachable and willing to listen, even where we agree to disagree. I thank them for that and wish them well. Can I also put on record my condolences to Astrid and the rest of the Gorey family. As Willie Rennie reminded the Chamber yesterday, Donald Gorey was a parliamentarian who enjoyed the respect and friendship of members across the Chamber for the work he did. While government special advisers were never his favourite species, I'm grateful to Donald for the courtesy he showed me in that role and for his advice and support upon my election in 2007. He will be greatly missed. Of course, Donald Gorey would have approved of the government's plans to bring forward legislation on same-sex marriage, not, as Willie Rennie quite rightly observed yesterday, so the state can dictate what happens, but rather to provide the freedom for churches and celebrants to conduct same-sex marriages where they are currently prevented from doing so. I know from my own mailbag the strength of feeling that exists on this issue. It has not been an easy decision, but for the reasons that I think Marco Biaggi very powerfully set out this afternoon, it is the right decision, and I congratulate Nicola Sturgeon on the way in which she has handled it. It is a shame that she is to be denied the opportunity to pilot this bill through the Parliament. I do think that her removal from Hearth to concentrate on the referendum will strike many people in Scotland as indicative of where the SNP's priorities now lie. That is not to dispute in any way the importance of the referendum nor the debate leading up to it, but it illustrates the problems created by the First Minister's determination to delay until 2014, a decision that, as Margot MacDonald warned, has come to dominate every debate and every issue that we consider in this Parliament. A number of members over the course of this debate have commented on the impact this delay is having. Other members will dispute the fact that ongoing uncertainty is having any effect at all. However, I think there can be no doubt about the extent to which this issue hangs over the work of this government and, by extension, this Parliament, in a way that ensures that other issues and other priorities struggle to get the attention they deserve. The SNP's result in last year's election was remarkable. Yet one of the crowning achievements last May was Mr Salmon's success in persuading so many Scottish voters that they could safely vote SNP without the need to support independence. And while this helped to deliver a dramatic result last May, it has left Mr Salmon with a problem ever since. Despite the SNP's success, support for independence has remained static and even fallen back in recent months. As a consequence, the First Minister has spent more of the last 16 months arguing for a second question he doesn't support than for the independence that he says he does. Indeed, the last 16 months, as Willie Rennie and others have suggested, has seen independence being redefined at a rate of knots, with ever larger swathes of the British state being clawed back into Mr Salmon's vision of an independent Scotland. It has even got to the stage where a number of Mr Salmon's own backbenchers have started to come out over the summer and publicly question the actions of the leadership. Retribution could be severe, and some of the NATO rebels may yet find themselves playing more of a supportive role in the construction of the new fourth crossing than they might wish. Of course, Alex Neil is now to have no hand in this following the reshuffle, and I wish him well in his new role, and I'm grateful to him for the way he has always engaged on the issues in his previous post. Procurement was key amongst them, and I welcome the Government's intention to bring forward a bill in this area. An urgent rebalancing of the procurement process is needed to enable more of our small and medium-sized businesses to bid competitively for public contracts. This need not result in higher costs, and achieving it will be good for jobs and wealth creation in communities across Scotland, including my own. Nevertheless, Mr Neil has raised expectations, particularly within the SME community, and Nicola Sturgeon must now deliver. Expectations have similarly been raised in relation to the Government's Welcome Children and Young People's Bill. I understand the reasons why the Cabinet Secretary has chosen to combine the two pieces of legislation, but this will present problems, and not just in the scrutiny of the proposals. From discussions I've had with children's charities, enforcement of entitlements of free early years care and education, and the requirements placed on councils to assess provision locally may be more difficult as a result of the wider-ranging legislation. As Bob Doris acknowledged, welcome though the commitment to additional free early years care and education is, there is a question as to why this cannot be put in place immediately, given the SNP's promise to deliver this by 2010. This attitude is also evident in the SNP's reluctance to press ahead with the changing Scottish Water to a public benefit corporation. This would ensure that the future remains firmly within the public sector, but release a windfall of potentially £1.5 billion. Up until the last election, we were told by SNP ministers that they were opposed to such a move in principle. We were also reliably informed that even if they were to act, the money could not be reinvested immediately. Now John Swinney has confirmed that he has no principled objection. Indeed, he is entirely happy to see Scottish Water mutualised or become a public benefit corporation, but only if Scottish voters vote for independence. This demonstrates that the dither and delay we have seen on this issue has deprived Scotland of much-needed investment, precisely the sort of investment that ministers and a series of backbenchers now claim they need for the shovel-ready projects. So instead of acting using the powers that they have to deliver investment in projects Scotland needs, SNP ministers are content to delay, blame Westminster and insist that they won't act until they have more powers. Deputy Presiding Officer, as I've said, there are elements of this legislation programme that I fully support, others which raise serious issues. I agree with Margaret MacDonald that Christine Graham raised a number of important ones in relation to justice. However, the sense is, and it's been confirmed by our first Skillimpians reshuffle today, that the primary focus of this government over the next 2 years is on preparing the ground for the referendum. If everything is always someone else's fault, if the solution to every question is always independence, however quickly that is being redefined, if a parliamentary majority is wielded in such a way to suggest criticisms or concerns about what the government is doing is somehow unpatriotic or talking Scotland down, we are in dangerous territory. The government must not conflate the interests of Scotland with those of the SNP. Thank you.
Many thanks. I now call on Murdo Fraser. Mr Fraser, you have 8 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I start by congratulating the new ministers appointed today and pay tribute to Bruce Crawford, Stuart Stevenson and Brian Adam for their service to the government. To see the purpose of a government revealed, you look at its legislative programme. So what does the First Minister's statement and the government's programme tell us about his government? Well, I think Joanne Lamont put it rather well yesterday when she said, "The country is on pause while the First Minister pursues the one thing that interests him, which is his constitutional agenda." Now, there are some worthy measures in the legislative programme we heard, but overall, it looks devoid of big ideas to take Scotland forward and address the people's priorities. And if we needed confirmation of that, it came today when we saw the Deputy First Minister, the most senior member of the government, bar the First Minister himself, moved away from the health service, a people's priority, to the SNP's priority, which is constitutional change. Now, I welcome some of what was proposed yesterday. I welcome more focus on early intervention, something we on this side of the chamber have been calling for years. I welcome more emphasis on childcare, again something we've been calling for years. And I note that even with what is proposed, that what will be happening in Scotland will not match what is happening south of the border. And of course, what is happening on childcare was promised not just last year in the SNP manifesto, but some 5 years ago in the SNP manifesto. So it's coming 5 years late. So where are the other bills to deliver what was promised by the SNP 5 years ago? Where is the bill to reduce class sizes to no more than 18 in primaries 1, 2 and 3? Where is the bill to pay off the debts of Scottish students? Where is the bill to replace student loans with student grants? Where is the bill to bring any first-time buyers grant of £2,000 per household. Maybe we have to wait until next year before these come forward. And if the claim from the SNP, as we've heard from a lot of the backbenchers yesterday and today, is that there is no money to pay for these things, well, it seems the SNP can find the money when it suits them to pay for the things they want. More money for students, more money for early intervention and more money for childcare. Nothing wrong with these things in themselves, but there's plenty of money to do what they want. Maybe these Westminster cuts don't look so draconian after all. Now let us look at the economic aspects of the programme, which the First Minister touched on yesterday. He talked a lot about this yesterday, improving Scotland's economy, and he made much of Scotland's economic performance compared to the UK as a whole, forgetting to mention that might have something to do with the relative size of the public sector in Scotland or the relative strength of the oil and gas sector in Scotland. But even on a UK-wide basis, I'd remind the SNP we've seen 1 million new jobs created in the private sector across the UK since 2010, more than double the number lost in the public sector. And we heard a lot from the SNP about the need for greater capital spend. Now, of course, the UK government have said they will look at this. But we have to remember, if we're only going to pay for more capital spend by borrowing more money, that is precisely what got us, this country, into the mess it's in the first place. And more capital spend will do very little good if all that money goes overseas. And anybody who's been out there talking to people in the business community, as I and some of my colleagues were just last week in Fife, they will hear constantly the refrain that public sector contracts, too many of them, are awarded to overseas contractors and the money goes out of the country. And you see large infrastructure projects awarded to Irish companies bringing in labour from overseas, living in porta cabins. Hardly any of that spend is going into the local economy. So it doesn't automatically deliver an uplift in economic performance. And that is why the procurement reform bill is so important and needs to be scrutinised so closely. Now, I appreciate there is a difficulty with EU rules around procurement. I would be the last presiding officer to advocate any breaking of EU rules on anything. But we have to get this right. Other countries seem to get round EU procurement rules and make sure that their home companies are getting a fair crack of the whip. So things can be done within the law, and this is of vital importance. Oh, well, I have so much choice. Mr Stewart, I'll give way to you.
Kevin Stewart.
I thank Mr Fraser for giving way. If there is so much that can be done to change European procurement rules, he can maybe tell us what the Tory Liberal government in London have been saying at the top table to try and change those rules.
Well, I know you've had a bad day, Mr Stewart. I know you didn't get the phone call you were hoping for from the First Minister, but there's no need to take it out on me. As you well know, the coalition government is working very hard within the EU on these issues. But of course, when the SNP have these powers, the SNP have powers to use on the economy, what do? They use them to penalise business. So what is the hardest hit sector of the economy? One of the hardest hit sectors of the economy, presiding officer? It is the retail sector. What did we see yesterday? The retail figures are down again. So what do the SNP do? They bring in a specific tax to hit the retail sector. And we see the property sector in difficulty. Landlords unable to rent their properties at any cost. What do the SNP do? They bring in a new tax on empty properties. So instead of bleating about the need for more powers, they need to start using their existing powers to help business, not hammer business. But, presiding officer, no, I need to make some progress, please. There was only one measure, only one bill that caused any excitement amongst the SNP backbenchers yesterday, and that, of course, was the bill to bring forward a referendum on independence. Now, still no detail, still no issue of timing, no question, no details of the franchise. 5 years on, no more detail or no more information. We still await the consultation outcome promised us by the end of the summer. I think we need to know, presiding officer, so we can get on with the real debate, away from process, on to the issues. And the more people look at the real issues, the more convinced they are that we are better together. Even SNP members are coming round to that view. It seems an independent Scotland will be more like the UK, so much like the UK, no one will notice the difference. We're going to keep the Queen, keep the pound, keep the Bank of England, keep common financial regulation. We may even keep NATO. And on that point, can I say, Presiding Officer, to the rebel SNP backbenchers, not a term we hear very often in this chamber, so let me repeat it, the rebel SNP backbenchers. I have a list, Presiding Officer.
Please
Here
don't read it because you have 30 seconds.
Jamie Hepburn, Jean Urquhart, John Finney, Dave Thompson, Gordon MacDonald, Sandra White, Marco Biaggi, John Wilson, John Mason. I'm sorry if I missed anybody out. The notable 9, none of them I note, put up for promotion today by the First Minister. Keep up that good work. Keep the rest of us entertained. I hope Joe Fitzpatrick knows what he's let himself in for. Because whisper it, if we stay in NATO, how long before we say we're going to keep Trident on the Clyde?
You must conclude,
Presiding Officer, it's not so much independence light. It's more like, I can't believe it's not Britain.
I now call on Jackie Baillie with 12 minutes maximum. Ordered, please.
Presiding Officer, the programme for government has always marked the start of a new parliamentary term. At its most basic, it forms the work programme for the Parliament over the coming year, and at its best, it represents our ambition and aspiration for our people and for Scotland. And I do genuinely think people will reflect in the challenging year that is to come that this programme for government has been a wasted opportunity. The SNP have a majority in this Parliament. It can be radical, it can be ambitious, and this was the moment to show Scotland what you could do. But instead we have a degree of timidity, an astonishing paucity of ambition, albeit with one or two notable exceptions. And let me say thank you to Jamie Hepburn for illustrating so well that Labour has led the debate on issues like the integration of health and social care and on things like welfare reform, and the SNP have followed. But, you know, yesterday and today, we've had a lot of assertion in place of fact, talking instead of action, and shouting by SNP backbenchers and, of course, Alex Neil, to cover up the lack of intellectual rigour in their proposals. Now, as the First Minister said, and on this point, even I can agree with him, he doesn't have a monopoly on wisdom. So maybe it is worth listening to the other voices in this chamber rather than simply trying to drown them out by shouting. Let me highlight a couple of areas of the legislative programme. And firstly, let me commend the Government and Nicola Sturgeon on bringing forward legislation on equal marriage. I welcome the intention to ensure that that legislation is accompanied by protection of freedom of speech and religion. And to that end, the SNP Government has made clear that it wishes amendments to be made to the Equality Act and will work with the UK Government to do so. So can I ask what progress has been made in the dialogue with the UK Government? And I wonder whether Alex Neil, who disappointingly isn't here, will use the opportunity soon to confirm his support for the legislation, as he has not so far done so. Secondly, I want to turn to the proposed Health and Social Care Integration Bill. Presiding Officer, Scottish Labour supports the integration of health and social care, but given the scale of the demographic challenges that we face, my view is the bill doesn't go far enough. Instead of the radical approach that I'd hoped to see to ending the postcode lottery of care, ending delayed discharge, ensuring that older people don't fall through the net, we have a set of proposals that on the one hand are very prescriptive and on the other so vague it is clear the author has little idea of what the Cabinet Secretary actually wants. The bill should specify national standards of care as well as outcomes, so that whether you live in Dumbarton or Dunbar, Dingwall or Dumfries, you can expect a consistency of approach. And we would have brought forward a bill without a set of confused governance arrangements, reporting to the Cabinet Secretary, the Council Leader, the Health Board Chair, and actually put local councillors in charge. That would bring democratic accountability to the parts of the NHS, and surely that is something the SNP would welcome. We would, of course, indeed so.
Derek Mackay.
The member, and I thank Jackie Baillie for giving way, is the member now revealing, having supported our plans for health and social care integration, that this is us now seeing an exhibition of the Labour Party playing politics with health and social care integration, as revealed by local government Labour in the Herald?
Jackie Bailey.
It's not at all the case. We have been consistent and clear with what our plans have been. My shame, if you like, is that the SNP have failed to copy them adequately and been radical enough in pursuing this forward. We would also have had a single budget, merging social work and health budgets for older people, rather than a confused and convoluted set of negotiations between a number of different partners. Our approach is to focus on the needs of older people. My regret is the government's bill is likely to be too timid to produce the kind of culture change we need to see for our older people now. And I am happy to work with the government to get this right. And I'm sure Bob Doris will share my disappointment that the approach of SNP councillors in Glasgow also rejected key proposals within the government's consultation. Let me turn next to the childcare bill. Whilst I welcome the increase in nursery hours, I'm genuinely disappointed that this has been so long in coming. The SNP promised exactly this in the manifesto way back in 2007. The proposal then, as it is now, is to entitle 3- and 4-year-olds to a minimum of 600 nursery hours a year. It could well be 2014 before that's fully delivered. That'll be 7 long years after you first promised it, and families are crying out for help now. They need more than part-time places. Families need access to wraparound care, access to childminders, access to before and after school care, and it must be affordable. Why is it that the cost of childcare is more expensive in Scotland than in the rest of England? We know that improving access to affordable quality childcare is good for families, but it's also good for the economy too. And isn't it just astonishing for a Scottish Government that spends much of its time telling us how progressive it is to be trumped by the Tories? In England, on provision for 2-year-olds, just 1% of them get a nursery place with the SNP, but in England with the Tories and the Lib Dems, 37% of 2-year-olds will get a nursery place. Where is the SNP's vision and where is their ambition for 2-year-olds? Now, you don't often hear MSPs talking about secondary legislation. It never merits a mention in the programme for government. But this year, we will see a swathe of secondary legislation on welfare reform, regulations that you won't be able to properly scrutinise because the SNP don't favour transparency, regulations covering council tax benefit and a range of passported benefits. And will they be any different to those proposed at Westminster? Now, we know that the SNP is very fond of telling us how things would be so much better if only they had the powers. Everything is the fault of those terrible people at Westminster. Now, I have to confess, when I look at Cameron's cabinet of right-wing millionaires that's increasingly male, pale and stale, three-quarters of who went to Oxbridge, I concede they may have a point, but you know, it is simply not good enough to blame someone else. You have the power to do things differently. Some of these benefits are now devolved, but instead of protecting the interests of the people of Scotland, you simply shrug your shoulders and pass on the Tory cuts. Where is the ambition there? Let me remind the Chamber of Strathclyde Region, a model of protecting its people from the Tory cuts then, with the vision to have a social justice strategy. Shame that we don't have the same level of ambition from the SNP government. And this at a time where the number of people receiving food parcels in Glasgow has doubled. We see a legislative programme that is largely technical and that is shameful. At a time where every family in Scotland is £1,200 a year worse off under the SNP, we see a legislative programme that doesn't actually do anything for jobs, for growth, and that too is shameful. Joanne Lamont was right yesterday. This is a country on pause. Forget the real-life problems that people are facing. Unemployment, fuel poverty, child poverty. Let's just talk endlessly about a referendum. And that is where I am different to the SNP. Because, you know, the thing that gets me up in the morning is not an obsession with the Constitution. It's an ambition to tackle poverty, to improve the life chances of our people, and to build a strong economy. Do you know, as someone who is half Portuguese, half Scottish, born in Hong Kong, the politics of identity espoused by the SNP leaves me cold. Because I believe in powers for a purpose, not some half-articulated, vague promise of jam tomorrow if you vote for independence, but actually you don't even use the powers you have now. The First Minister is also very fond of telling us that decisions about Scotland are best made by those who live and work in Scotland. So someone please explain to me why, if that is the case, you are ceding monetary control to the Bank of England, ceding control of regulation to the London-based Financial Services Authority, and about to cede control over much of defence policy to NATO. Hardly decisions made in Scotland. Presiding Officer, I welcome the referendum bill. We need clarity about the question, the franchise. We need to look beyond that to engage in a debate about the best future for Scotland. But let me just touch on John Swinney's evasive performance on Newsnight last night. On the basis of his discomfort, I'm beginning to wonder whether the First Minister has already conceded the second question. Now, we all know he wants two questions because he won't get the right answer to the first one, but what this tells me is that he has singularly failed to take his backbenchers and his party with him. This is the SNP's golden moment. This is their once-in-a-lifetime chance to tear Scotland out of the United Kingdom, but no amount of calculation or guile from the First Minister, and he is capable of much of it, will stand in the way of their ambition. And of course, Nicola Sturgeon, I understand, believes that there should only be one question too. And whilst I will say more about Nicola in a minute, I can't help but think that what we're seeing is succession planning before our very eyes, and I wish her well. Fascinating, though, that whilst the independence debate may be, for all intents and purposes, of interest to us in this chamber, the real challenges are being faced in our communities now outside these doors. The challenge of putting food on the table, the challenge of clothing your children, the challenge of heating your home, the challenge of getting a job. None of this will be helped by the SNP's referendum. In fact, none of this will really be helped by the legislative programme before us, or indeed by the reshuffle to which I now turn. It is interesting that the Tories reshuffle their cabinet yesterday. Alex Salmond does his today. The umbilical cord clearly stretches to Bute House. And indeed, I wonder if you are actually better together. But regardless of that, and regardless of the differences I have had with the Deputy First Minister, I have always respected her talent and energy, and I have always enjoyed working with her. I'm not quite sure she would say the same of me, but we are missing you already, Nicola. It is a shame, though, that talent and that energy is now being diverted. The fact that she's been moved to run the referendum campaign shows the real priorities of this SNP government. Separation is the first priority, the last priority, and the only priority of the SNP. And her replacement is none other than the Parliament's own pantomime dame. A master of diversion if the facts don't suit him. But you know, it won't work with the NHS. I just hope you get to grips with the job quickly. Yesterday, the SNP presiding officer said that reshuffles without changing economic policy were meaningless. Yesterday, the SNP launched a legislative agenda which failed to address those pressing economic issues. They have nothing to say to the many thousands of Scots worried about making ends meet, worried about their jobs and worried about their children getting jobs in the future. The obsession with separation has been shown both yesterday and again today, and is evident with the Deputy First Minister being put in charge of the referendum at a time of real problems emerging with the NHS. In closing, presiding officer, Alex Neil faces a challenging agenda. He faces the fact that there are fewer staff in the NHS than at any point in the last 7 years, that the SNP have cut the NHS budget by £319 million. A&E waits are increasing, cancer waiting times are not being met, and there are basic issues of dignity, presiding officer, that aren't being addressed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I now call on Mike Russell to wind up the debate. You have 17 minutes, please.
Thank you, presiding officer, and thank you to the Chamber for the warm welcome to me. These are very much ritual and theatrical occasions, these programme for government debates. I've sat through many of them. I missed the ones from 2003 to 2007, but it was such a pleasure to come back and see them as a minister. But I am very much reminded of a poster that I used to have on the wall of my room at university. It was a historic Pan Am poster and there was a cartoon figure pointing over its shoulder, and it said, the caption said, "The real world's not in here, it's out there." And that is the reality of this debate. Because there may be theatrical occasions, there may be a great ritual to them. The opposition says that not enough is being done. I think I quote Murdo Fraser, who said, "The country is on pause." Though this is some pause, I have to say. The country is on pause. But the reality is that there is an enormous amount of hard work in this document, and it is work that each of us will have to do. Because bill after bill here will require the scrutiny of this Parliament, it will require the care of this Parliament, it will require the support of this Parliament. So I would plead to the opposition in their ritual, don't talk down the achievements that we all have to do for the people of Scotland over the next year. Let us put our shoulder to the wheel and do them. But of course there is a sharper edge to it this year, because there's been another theme throughout this debate, and it's come up again and again. I think Jackie Baillie just said, "I believe in powers for a purpose." Earlier on in this debate yesterday, Hugh Henry, and I shall come back to his contribution, Hugh Henry said, tackling poverty and injustice is central to what we do. And indeed, at the very heart of this programme is a bill to tackle poverty and injustice. At the very heart of this programme, there is a bill that will do what each of us should do in the Scottish Parliament, to make a better Scotland for everyone who lives here. And that is a bill that is not an end, but a means to the end that we should all share. And that means to the end is a referendum leading to independence. So, part of this ritual, however, has something else in it that we need to pause and consider. Because part of the ritual I've found over the years is the angrier that the opposition is, the bigger the vacuum in their own proposals. The angrier the opposition is, the bigger the fear they have of what is being done by the government. And when you look at that today, it is starkly illustrated. Let's start with the opening of this debate. I think I shall pass over the contribution of the leader of the Tories, who I'm sorry, he's just here, I have to say. I just have to say that she had beside her a lean, well, no, not lean, but a hungry-looking Mr. Carlaw. I suspect his time might be coming on the light of that performance yesterday. I have to say to Mr. Rennie, that was the best speech that I've heard him make. I thought it was a speech from the heart. I didn't agree with all of it. It's a pity he has so few followers. But it was a speech that was worth listening to. But the real problem in the debate came from the leader of the Labour Party, I have to say. It was a speech that wasn't worthy of her or worthy of her party. It was a speech of the most astonishing negativity, and it was a speech of pure anger. But it wasn't an anger for change in Scotland. It wasn't an anger to make sure that we get that change. It was an anger that had its roots still, and regrettably, because it's taken a long time to get over it, it had its roots in the failure to achieve office in 2007 and again in 2011. It had an anger in that sense of entitlement that Labour still has in this chamber. And that entitlement has gone completely. There need to be ideas to earn office. And it was a speech devoid of ideas. And you saw in that those contributions from Labour yesterday and today, that great fear and that great anger. That knowledge that there is no policy that is backing what is taking place. There is just a recognition they're as far from office as they could possibly be. And you also saw the conflict in those contributions. And I want to mention two in particular, because I think they are significant. I actually didn't disagree much with what Neil Findlay said. He is attempting to be the new Tommy Sheridan, but I have to say that his sense of anger at some of the things that people suffer in Scotland is undoubtedly correct. But how conflicted his statement was. But Neil Findlay has spent the summer in his Red Collective arguing for change in Scotland. But when he gets to the point of what change should be, he cannot face reality. Because the logic of what Mr. Findlay said was undeniable. The logic is that there has to be full constitutional change in Scotland, the powers for this Parliament, and then you can act. You can persuade others to act. But, presiding officer, until that happens, Mr. Findlay can't get any of his ambitions. And neither can Mr. Hugh Henry. I have to say that I listened with some interest to Mr Henry yesterday, because I don't think anybody in this chamber should get up and essentially, in what one might call the militant school of rhetoric, lecture people on a variety of issues and refuse to debate. Oh, I'm happy if he wants to intervene. He doesn't want to intervene. Right, okay. Right, let me, therefore, I think one has to go through a speech like that and point out, perhaps, when the facts given might not be facts. So I have 10 points here that I want to draw to Mr Henry's attention. There are 10 points that we need to know about what's happening in Scottish education and in Scotland generally. Let's start with poverty. Mr Henry made assertions about poverty yesterday, but in reality, the percentage of people in relative poverty fell between 2009-10 and 10-11, an achievement of this government against the most appalling economic circumstances and without the full powers we need. Mr Henry also accused the Scottish Government of allowing the better off to flourish and the poor and marginalised to suffer. Between 2009-10 and 10-11, the proportion of working-age adults in relative poverty fell again, a reduction of 70,000. Could we do better? Yes, we could do better. How can we do better? By having independence. But it fell, it did not rise. Then he talked about teacher numbers. Now, circumstances have changed, I give him that. We're in difficult times. Cuts that have come, what are they to be? I think the First Minister quotes the former Chancellor quite effectively. Deeper than Thatcher's, coming from a Labour Chancellor. Tougher than Thatcher's. I'm sorry to misquote the First Minister. Deeper and tougher than Thatcher. I have it right now. First Minister is always a great assistance to me. But I have to say that even in those circumstances, here's a fact. We have not only met our targets in classes, we've done better. In 2006, when I think Mr Henry was the Education Minister, the average primary one class size was 23.1. The latest census, it was 20.5. In 2006, I think, when Mr Henry was Education Minister, there were 16,845 pupils in primary one classes of 26 or more. The latest census, that figure has been reduced to 609, a reduction of 96%. And teacher unemployment in Scotland is now lower than anywhere else in the UK. Mr Henry also dealt with the question of unemployment and unemployment amongst women. But the latest data produced by ONS shows that unemployment amongst women did increase, right? It's high, it's too high, but we also know that the work programmes are being effective. And if Mr Henry had had an ounce of fairness in him, he would have reflected that work and the work of the first Minister for Youth Employment in all of these islands. College budgets were his next subject. Now, you heard a great deal, Presiding Officer, about college budgets over the last 2 days. What you didn't hear was the reform agenda that we're pursuing in the colleges, except this afternoon. And I do very much welcome Mr MacDonald's intervention and question on that this afternoon, because what he pointed out was what was taking place, the focusing of colleges on employment need. Our colleges have responded to the challenge. We have the best higher education student support package. We've got colleges prioritising young learners. The opportunities for all, the first time ever in these islands, is providing education, training or a job to every young person. Mr MacDonald, can you surpass your earlier contribution?
I'm very grateful to Mr Russell for giving way, and it's a habit that he should develop because it becomes him. Can I suggest to him that the very point I was making was around the need for colleges to meet the needs within the economy? And can I alert him to the fact that the colleges that particularly raised my concerns in Aberdeen and in Banffin have faced the need to reduce core education and training over the last 2 years as a result of changes in budgets? And can he use this opportunity to assure us that that pattern will not be continued?
Cabinet Secretary.
I see that the thumbscrews have been applied during the afternoon. Your helpful contribution earlier has been clawed back. The core educational opportunities are not being reduced. What is taking place is those colleges are focusing on the real needs of employers. We're making sure also, and Mr McNeill asked this question this afternoon, we're making sure that we bring together those who need work, those who need training, and they actually get it through our college system. I think you would want to encourage, Mr MacDonald would want to encourage his local colleges, not discourage them in those activities. But let us move on to modern apprenticeships. I'm only on point 7 of the 10 points, and I'm conscious that time is passing. Now, despite Labour's claims, modern apprenticeships have always been open to those seeking employment and those in employment. Indeed, under the previous administration, the balance was actually further towards training for those already employed. In 2006, and was Mr Henry not the Education Minister at that time, 49% of modern apprenticeship starts aged 16 to 24 were in employment for more than 6 months. By last year, that had fallen to 23%. I give way.
Kezia Dugdale.
Presiding Officer, we've been here before. The very point of the matter is that in 2006, Scotland's economy was booming. In 2012, the economy is flatlining, yet he still forces the same old rules about modern apprenticeships from 6 years ago to the national youth unemployment crisis we have now.
I'm glad that the member recognised that times have changed. That was not what Mr Henry did yesterday. But yes, absolutely, and we've changed with the times. Excuse me, Presiding Officer, I'm about to tell the member how they've changed. How many modern apprenticeships do we have now? Last year, 26,000. 10,000 more than existed then. So we have risen to that challenge. But the basic fact remains, the point that was made about modern apprenticeships in training wasn't accurate. I am on my last 2 points for Mr Henry at least. In 2007, I believe, when Mr Henry ceased to be Education Minister, the entitlement to preschool education was 412.5 hours. We raised it to 475 hours. We're raising it to 600 hours. That is an achievement. And finally, there was, of course,
Margaret MacDonald.
Presiding Officer, I'm prepared to concede that there are a number of points which have been raised by the Minister that are, I think, pleasing to all of this House when we forget the party political rhetoric. But here's one that doesn't please me. 7% reduction in PE teachers over the last year. Why?
Cabinet Secretary.
Because we have an education system, as a member knows, in which local authorities make those decisions. However, I am glad to say that even in those adverse circumstances, we have made more progress towards the target of PE hours in schools in Scotland than any of our predecessors, and we will go on doing so. And indeed, my colleague, the Minister for the Commonwealth Games, has recently allocated more resources to finish that task. That's an achievement. The final point for Mr Henry. He asked me directly and then refused to take a contribution when I was going to answer it, whether I would involve teachers in the decision-making about taking forward the teaching profession, and particularly the issue of nursery teachers. Of course. We always involve teachers. And indeed, it was this government which overruled a decision of a previous government in which I believe Mr Henry was the Education Minister. In those circumstances, we managed to put teachers and then parents on the planning board for Curriculum for Excellence. We will always involve all the stakeholders in making decisions on education. Now, I'm glad I've been of assistance to the Chamber and Mr Henry in putting those points forward. But I go back to the core issue that we're debating today, and I want to say a word or two about the contribution that Margaret MacDonald made, because she was absolutely right. She appealed to both sides of the argument in the referendum to talk about the positives and to tell people what they wanted to see. And it is an obligation on every single one of us to talk about the plans we have for change, to talk about them in ways that show our vision of what we want to achieve. Because what we are trying to do is to change Scotland for good. We have a positive vision. The members on this side of the chamber were elected last year on three things. On the team that we had and the team that constantly develops and builds and improves, the record that we had in government, and the people of Scotland judged that and judged it favourably. But the third thing was vision. And it is the vision that we have of the future of Scotland that should be contended and should be debated. And it is a vision that says there are things that need changed. It is a vision that says we need to have a post-16 reform bill because we've got more to do. It is a vision that says there's more to do with children and with kinship care. It is a vision to say that there are changes in procurement that we need to take place. It is a vision that says our criminal justice system continues to need to change. All of those are visions. But wrapping round that, the real vision, is the vision of what this country can become. The Deputy First Minister said in her opening speech this afternoon that she had supported the idea of independence all her adult life. Well, I regret that I went wrong. For a very brief period of time at university, I was a member of the Labour Party. And I publicly repent at this moment. Because I do believe in social progress. I do believe in a change in Scottish society for the better. I do believe in empowering. I do believe in eliminating poverty. And that leads me inexorably to the view that the only change that you can have in Scotland will achieve that. The only change that will produce the Scotland we want to see. The only change that will be honest to the traditions of the Labour Party as well as the traditions of every other party. The only change, presiding officer, is to achieve independence. And I am very pleased to be a member of a government that will give the people of Scotland that choice. Let us, each of us here today, at the conclusion of this debate, make a pledge. We'll debate vision. We'll debate what we want to achieve. We'll give up on the negativity, the anger, the angst, and particularly we'll give up on the way in which we try and present things that aren't true. I am very pleased to conclude this debate.
Thank you very much. That concludes the debate on the Scottish Government's programme, and it's now time to move on to the next item of business to which we now come. And the next item of business is a statement by Keith Brown on ferry services to Orkney. The Minister will take questions at the end of his statement, and there should therefore be no interventions or interruptions. Mr. Brown, I call on you when you are ready. You have 10 minutes to make your statement, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. For my part, I'm delighted to be able to give this statement to members today, so soon, in fact, after the Scottish Cabinet's very successful meeting in Orkney. I also had the opportunity recently to travel to Orkney myself by ferry under the new management and enjoyed, as usual, the Orcadian hospitality and some very helpful and pragmatic discussions with the Islands Council. I was, though, Presiding Officer, a little confused when the Labour Party asked for a ministerial statement on ferries to Orkney. Not on the content. The Scottish Government understands, of course, the importance of ferries to the communities of Orkney and Shetland, but on the timing. The most recent events regarding ferries to Orkney and Shetland took place in the last parliamentary term, when the Scottish Government concluded its tendering of the Northern Isles Ferry Services contract. A preferred bidder, Serco, was announced on the 4th of May. There was a short delay as one of the other bidders appealed the outcome. The court found in the Government's favour and the contract was signed on the 1st of June. The new contract commenced as planned on the 5th of July, and this followed a well-managed handover period for which I must congratulate the staff of both of the outgoing operator, Northlink Ferries, and the incoming operator, Serco. These events were certainly of public interest and created understandable, although temporary, concern for staff and for ferry users. Some members did take the chance to speak to me about this at the time, but I don't recall any calls from Labour for a ministerial statement on that issue. By my reckoning, there were 8 weeks between the announcement of the preferred bidder and the end of the last parliamentary term. If I'd been asked for a statement, then I would gladly have given it. We're now in the new parliamentary term, looking ahead to new challenges and opportunities, including a new legislative programme announced yesterday by the First Minister. However, for the next 30 minutes, we've been asked by the Labour Party to look back, and so we will. I've set out the main milestones already that led to the successful handover to Serco on the 5th of July. Serco have chosen to trade, of course, as Serco Northlink for the provision of these services, recognising the value that the communities attach to the Northlink brand. As I've mentioned, I've had the opportunity to use the ferry service myself when I travelled to Orkney on the 9th of July. I was very impressed, as always, with the service and would recommend it to all members. The vessels that we have that provide these services are among the best in Scotland. Although the latest ferry we've introduced to the Hebrides, the £25 million MV Finlaggan, is of a similar standard, and the new £42 million ferry for the Stornoway-Ullapool route that I announced on the 8th of June will be a further step forward in technical prowess. And that new vessel will also use around a quarter less fuel than the current service, which is important given the Parliament's climate change targets and ambitions. The Serco Northlink staff, by and large, of course, the same staff who have been providing an outstanding service for many years, on board and on shore, continue to provide an efficient and courteous service, and the on-board facilities are excellent.
There were those, of course, who were concerned about the change in operator, and I can understand that. Change always brings a degree of uncertainty, and it is the responsibility of the new operator to prove that they are up to the task. The feedback from customers and stakeholders that I have received is that Serco Northlink have achieved that. They have adopted the Northlink brand, employed the same staff, are deploying the same vessels, and there has been much more continuity than there has been change. They have improvements planned for the future, which I am sure ferry users in Orkney and Shetland will welcome. One change that users, particularly in Shetland, will notice and appreciate is that Serco Northlink are taking a fresh approach to vessel overhauls. And I understand that this winter there will be no interruption to services, in contrast to the long dry dock period last year. This responds, I believe, to the representations I received from the local community, the council and the constituency MSP. I also received representations from the trade unions about the position of their members. The contract that we put in place ensured the transfer of all those employees who wish to transfer with their terms and conditions intact. There was a particular concern about pensions, and strike action was briefly mooted by the RMT. But thanks to the provisions of the contract and what I believe was the commendable response of Serco Northlink management and the RMT in getting round the table, I'm pleased to say that this was quickly resolved to the satisfaction, I understand, of the RMT. But I do plan to follow that up with the RMT when I meet with them tomorrow afternoon. In tendering the Northern Isles ferry services, the Scottish Government, of course, was doing nothing different than that which had been done by its predecessors. The Labour Party and, after devolution, the Liberal Democrats were responsible for the award of 3 Northern Isles contracts. The first to P&O Scottish Ferries in 1997, the second to the original Northlink that commenced in 2002, and when that contract failed, the third to the second incarnation of Northlink in 2006. Now, we may not always support the tendering of public services, and I'm sure that many Labour members feel the same. However, we are working to the same set of European rules that they did when they were in government. And as Duncan McNeill, whose constituency includes the David McBrain headquarters, said when Parliament debated this issue in 2005, the primacy of European Union law over United Kingdom law is long established. We might not like it, but we need to make the best of it. We need to meet our international obligations and our moral obligations to those who elected us. When we have to tender public services, we obviously have an obligation to do so efficiently and effectively and to work within the current rules. The Northern Isles tendering exercise attracted 4 high-quality and competitive bids, and this ensured that we had the continuation of a high-quality ferry service as well as best value for public money. Since 2007, we've allocated record sums of money to the ferry services in Scotland, and that's been despite both severe cost pressures on public spending, the pressures on public spending, and the pressures on costs, for example, the pressures on the rising cost of fuel. And for example, in the last financial year, we absorbed an increase in subsidies to Calmac and to Northlink due to fuel costs of around £14 million. However, I'm also looking to secure changes to the EU rules. I've met with the European Commission to point this out, in particular the absurdity of a maximum contract length for ferries of 6 years, when under parallel EU rules, rail contracts can be at least 15 years long. I'll continue to make that case to the European Union. Looking forward, we've committed to publishing our final ferries plan by the end of the year, and that will provide a blueprint for improvements to ferry services across the country, as well as a foundation for a long-term programme of investments in modern, efficient vessels and accompanying shoreside infrastructure. And these investments, of course, support jobs in Scotland, for the ferry operators themselves, but also in civil engineering and shipbuilding. And I'm very proud that this Scottish Government has brought commercial shipbuilding back to the Clyde, with the award of a contract for 2 cutting-edge hybrid ferries to Ferguson, safeguarding 75 jobs, creating 100 more jobs, and for the future, 20 modern apprenticeships. So following the publication of the final ferries plan, we will focus on the next major challenge, the replacement of the contract for the Clyde and Hebrides ferry services, which expires in October 2013. The current contract, as we know, was awarded to Calmac Ferries in 2007 by this Government, following a competitive tendering exercise undertaken by the previous administration. We will be soon announcing our plans for the procurement of the next contract. I am aware, of course, that the trade unions have concerns, as they had before in the Northlink tendering process. They have concerns about how their Calmac members might be affected. They raised the same concerns with me at the time of the Northern Isles tendering, and I was able to work constructively with them and to achieve an outcome that all parties appear to be satisfied with, notwithstanding, as I've mentioned, the concerns that we both share about the current EU tendering rules. I have 2 meetings planned with the unions for the coming weeks to listen to and respond to those concerns. So to conclude, Presiding Officer, I can assure members that I am always happy to come here and defend the Government's record on ferries. We have achieved, as I've mentioned with the examples I've given, record investments, maintained services despite severe financial pressures, and we're once again seeing commercial ships being built on the Clyde. I said at the start, Presiding Officer, that I was confused by the request from Labour for this statement, but I hope that nobody is in any doubt about the strength and clarity of our commitment to our island communities and to the ferries that serve them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The Minister will now take questions on the issues raised in his statement, and I intend to allow around 20 minutes for questions, after which we will move to the next item of business. It would be helpful if members who wish to ask a question were to press the request to speak buttons now. And I would call on Richard Baker to ask the first question, to be followed by Alec Johnson.
Thank you. Can I thank the Minister for making this statement today, which we actually requested on the general issue of ferry services in the light of events over the summer, although the award of the North Link contract has been central to these developments and new information about this process has come to the fore. Ferry services, we all agree, are lifeline services and crucial to island communities in terms of their economic impact too, not least as employers. Is the Minister aware both RMT and Unite have raised concerns over what the decision to award the North Link contract to Serco, rather than to the publicly owned CalMac, means for the route, and indeed for other routes to be tendered next year? Does the Minister recognise the concerns over the repercussions of this decision, including last week the resignation of the Chief Executive of the David McBrain Group, and reports of disputes with ministers? Can I ask the Minister if it is true he or his officials instructed CalMac or their then directors at Northlink not to appeal the decision to award the contract to Serco? Is it the case, as has been previously reported, that in terms of cost, the CalMac bid was not more expensive than the Serco bid, and that it was ruled out on a technicality which could have been challenged? Finally, the Minister has raised the issue of EU tendering rules, and in his statement he referred to the replacement of the contract for the Clyde and Hebrides ferry services next year. Does he agree this should be tendered as a single contract, which he is empowered to do? But it is in his statement.
Minister.
Well, a number of those questions go well beyond the remit of the statement which I've just made, Presiding Officer, but I will try to answer them where I can. First of all, I did try to be a bit more general in the statement I made to cover some of these issues. To go to the point about the tendering process, I'm not sure whether what Richard Baker is saying, that we had a choice as to which decision we took, who we awarded the contract in relation to the Northern Isles. I don't know if he's saying that we should have taken a different approach in the previous administration. Now, I read it before Duncan McNeill's fairly candid approach to saying we had to follow these regulations. Michael McMahon said the same thing. He asked of opposition members at that time, are they really prepared to allow the decision on the tender process to be taken out of the hands of the Minister for Transport and handed over to EU officials? Now, that is the consequence if you take a decision which is not based on the best outcome. He asked, for example, did I agree to the Northlink tender in the knowledge that the CalMac tender costs less? I have no idea if the CalMac tender costs less. It did not qualify to be considered. It cannot be looked at. That is the process, and we have to go by that process. I'm very clear that the outcome that we achieved by that is to have an improving ferry service, a great deal of continuity and stability. I've mentioned the same ships, the same vessels, and by and large the same staff that were providing the service before, and I think that's a good outcome, along with significant improvements, some of which have been mentioned already in relation to dry dock arrangements, which people on the islands and stakeholders were unhappy about, which we've addressed, and I'm sure there are further improvements to come. Richard Baker also mentioned the question of instructions to the CalMac Board. I issued no instructions to the CalMac Board, and neither did Alec Neil in his capacity as Cabinet Secretary. We have, of course, got an obligation as a major stakeholder in David McBrain to make clear what our view of the public interest is and the stakeholder interest is, but no instructions were ordered. And as I say, I am confident that the services provided in relation to the Northern Isles have been improved and safeguarded. An expenditure of around £240 million, around £250 million on ferry service to the Northern Isles gives some idea of the extent of this Government's commitment to the lifeline services that they enjoy.
Thank you very much. And I would remind members that questions are on ferry services to Orkney. Alec Johnson, next question, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I begin by expressing my shared enthusiasm for the integrity of the tendering process. I believe that the process that was entered into for the Northlink ferries is one that is defensible. Indeed, it would have been subject to a legal challenge were it not. And I believe it's extremely important that we stand by this process, and I congratulate the Minister for doing so. However, there are a number of issues that are raised by the statement which I would like to address, although it has to be said that the number of issues that are raised by this statement today are rather less than some that I may have experienced before. The first thing I'd like to ask the Minister is, he says in his statement that we, meaning the Government, may not always support the tendering of public services. I'm tempted to ask, why not? It's something we should do more of. Can I also say that he has my support in ensuring that EU rules are changed if that change makes future contracts more attractive and produces more bidders? Will he offer a guarantee that he will not use any attempt to influence EU rules to close down future tendering processes? Finally, can I ask him, has he learned any lessons during this process that will facilitate an effective tendering for the Clyde and Hebridean services that will ensure that it attracts a range of bidders, possibly even from among Scotland's successful small ferry companies, that will facilitate the opportunity to provide high-quality services at efficient costs both for passengers and taxpayers across the Clyde and Hebrides area, and ensure also that it facilitates the same seamless transition should such a transition be necessary?
Minister.
Can I first of all respond to the point about tendering? And as somebody who worked for nearly 20 years in local government and was for 11 years a local government councillor, I have experience of the CCT regime which was introduced by the Thatcher government and the extraordinary costs, bureaucracy and destruction of many public services which that resulted in. I think that alone gives you an idea that public tendering is not always the best process depending on the service that you're trying to provide. The second point is there is no question that we will attempt to use EU legislation to close down competition. In fact, EU legislation, by and large, is designed to ensure that competition takes place. I think Alec Johnson is right to say that the outcome of that process in relation to the Northern Isles show the Government is committed to carrying out that process as efficiently as possible. And also it can result, and I believe in this case did result, in the most efficient way of providing that service, which can also improve the service, but also does so with regard to the public cost, which is very important. I think it's also true to say that the tendering which we've had so far, or at least the background information we've had so far in relation to future tenders, and he mentioned the Chiefs contract, which is upcoming, suggests to me, not least because of the tendering process which took place in relation to Northern Isles, is a very healthy interest. Now, I have no way, of course, of knowing who will tender for those contracts, whether it's a single tender or many tenderers, or whether even some small tenderers come forward, as he suggested. We've got decisions to take in relation to those issues very shortly. But I do know the appetite is there. People see these services as very important ones, and they also know the extent to which the Government is committed to them. So I don't think at this stage, of course, we're well away from starting the process, there's any suggestion that we're not going to have anything other than healthy competition for those tenders.
Thank you. I now call on Liam MacArthur, the constituency member for Orkney.
Presiding Officer, can I thank the Minister for advance sight of his statement, and while he might have enjoyed his trip on the Ham Vote back in July, I can advise him that he was well advised to steer clear of it on Monday as it roller coastered through the Hoy Sound. He will recall from his meetings and the correspondence with Tavish Scott and myself earlier this year, the retendering of these lifeline services has raised a range of concerns for our constituents. Staffing terms and conditions have certainly been key amongst them, but adequacy of freight provision, cuts to sailings on the Pentland Firth, supplier contracts and future pricing arrangements have also been high on the agenda. Picking up on a couple of these, does he agree that to ensure a smooth transition and build on the excellent work done by Northlink over the previous contract, Serco will rely heavily on existing crew and staff and therefore must reach agreement with and provide certainty to those staff without delay? And I'm glad he's having the meeting tomorrow with RMT on this matter. And does the Minister further agree that the extent of the cuts proposed by Serco to the sailings operating on the Pentland Firth route undermine his and Serco's claims about delivering an improved service? And will he therefore urge Serco to look again at those specific plans?
Minister.
Can I say to Liam MacArthur that he, I know, was in favour, for example, of the Scrabster-Stromness route being protected and of the 90-minute crossing being protected, and I think we did a substantial amount of work to make sure those vital interests of people in Orkney were protected. On the wider issue of the staff terms and conditions, my understanding, and we are not the employer in relation to this, obviously it's a new contractor that's the employer, is that the discussions have taken place with the relevant trade unions and employee representative groups. And my understanding is those have reached a satisfactory conclusion, both in terms of the terms and conditions, which are not changing for those employees. And I do agree with Liam MacArthur about the excellence of the service that they've given and continue to give. But those staff terms and conditions have not changed, and my understanding from the discussions between the employer in this case and the employees is that they seem to be well pleased with the outcome thus far of those negotiations. Now, obviously, we don't stand back completely dispassionate from these. We do have an interest in making sure the service continues to run, but so far I have to say that many of the issues which he's raised with me, have been raised with individuals concerned. One example would be the freight services, which we've talked to the stakeholders about, and after discussion we seem to be reaching satisfactory either resolution of the actual issue or given the reassurance which perhaps wasn't obvious at the time of greatest change when the tender changed. So I think we're reaching a satisfactory conclusion. That was certainly the burden of the discussion I had with Orkney Islands Council, who also raised concerns, but of course you'll continue to listen to any concerns there might be.
Thank you. I just make members aware that there are a large number of questions seeking to be asked, so if questions could be brief and to the point and answers similarly brief, we might just get everyone in. I now call Jean Urquhart.
Thank you, Minister. I suspect you've answered this question in your statement to a certain extent, but can you confirm that in tendering Northern Isles and in the upcoming Clyde and Hebrides ferry services that you're taking the same approach as that of previous administrations, and that that you're obliged to do this under EU law, no matter how much we like it or dislike it?
I think it's a very good point to emphasise again that we are following the same process. The process that was followed both by previous administrations and that is laid down for us by the European Union. Although, having said that, as I've mentioned already, we're not content simply to accept that. We believe that the regulations are inadequate in at least one very important regard, which is the length of contract that we can enter into. And I think anybody can understand that the levels of investment which are required for vessels would certainly allow a longer contract period to allow that investment to be recouped. So we believe we should continue to put pressure on the EU to make sure that we can change the level of contract as we do for trains, and as can happen for buses and other public services. But that, with that exception and with those representations we're making, we are following exactly the same process as previous administrations have followed, both in relation to Northern Isles, and we will do so again in relation to the Chiefs contract.
Thank you. David Stewart.
Sir, will the Minister take steps to ensure that the 2P protection for Northlink workforce are honoured by Serco? The company, of course, will seek to maximise its profits, and that's the name of the game. But is it crucially important that we look after ensuring that there's not a cutting of jobs, pay and terms and conditions to the detriment of the workforce and island communities? And finally, Presiding Officer, let me just give the Minister one bit of information. He may be aware that Serco has not agreed to participate in the Merchant Navy Officers' Pension Plan, which is something the Union Nautilus is looking at currently.
Minister.
Well, I'm happy to look at that issue, although the information I have is that all the relevant organisations and trade unions were involved in the discussions which I mentioned previously that took place with Serco, and there seemed to have been a satisfactory resolution to those talks, but I'm happy to look at that issue again. In relation to the terms and conditions, once again, I have to say that the terms and conditions which were previously enjoyed are going to be enjoyed in future under Serco's management. That agreement has been reached with the trade unions, the employer and the representative groups. And just to underline the point about TUPE, I met with the trade unions well before, many months before the contract was actually let, and gave them assurances which I believe were very important to them about going as far as we can to insist on TUPE being respected in the first place, and that those reassurances have resulted in the terms and conditions agreement which I've mentioned. So we obviously have a concern about that. We obviously have contract law which we have to have regard to, but we are looking at these interests with these interests of the staff with a real priority, and it seems to have been successful on this occasion.
Thank you. John Finney.
Sir, an element of duplication here. What discussions has the Minister had with the trade unions regarding the transfer of staff and protection of pensions of the former Northlink ferries?
Minister.
Just to say that I did meet with the trade unions on the 11th of October last year. I was happy to confirm with them at that time our understanding of the TUPE regulations and that they would apply. As I've also mentioned, I'm meeting with the RMT tomorrow afternoon and we're meeting with the other trade unions very shortly thereafter.
Thank you. Jamie McGregor.
Can the Minister give details of the discussions he and his officials have had with Serco to ensure that the transport of livestock to and from Orkney and the export of fresh produce, including shellfish from the islands, remain key considerations of the service contract, given how important these industries are to the Orkney economy and the reputation for quality that that island has? Minister.
We had substantial conversations. This is one of the key aspects of the contract. So we had substantial consultations with the stakeholders involved, the freight companies, those that provided the services, and also the iterative process that was undertaken with each of the bidders highlighted this as a crucial issue. So I am confident that the freight interests of the islands was taken into account and is being serviced properly by the freight companies. Obviously, we're early into the new contract. If there anything occurs which causes concern, we'll be happy to look at that again.
Rob Gibson.
President Officer, given past disruption in the Northlink service from Scrabster in my constituency to Stromness, badly affected by the dry docking issues, can the Minister elaborate from his statement what steps will be taken to ensure that we do not see a repeat of the situation where dry dock problems cause ferries to be out of action for months, as has happened in previous contracts? Minister.
Can I say that I do accept that this wasn't designed in at the previous contract, but it was something that was possible that could happen. It did happen last year, and as Rob Gibson mentions, caused substantial consternation on the islands. I did say, when I met with people in Shetland last January, that the new contract would not allow that situation to be repeated. And as I mentioned in my statement, just to say that this year there will be no dry docking whatsoever. And the work that will take place on the ships will also not lead to any disruption to services, which I think is a first on this contract.
Thank you. Rhoda Grant, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I ask if best value was considered as part of the letting of this contract? The Minister is aware that I've asked in the past that councils be allowed to lease vessels from CMAL, and if this were the case, keeping all these contracts in the public sector would allow more flexible use of vessels to cover maintenance and breakdowns as referred to, and therefore provide better value to the public purse.
Minister.
I have to say I'm not certain as to what the member means by keeping these contracts in the public sector. These contracts have been tendered on a commercial basis for a number of years now by previous administrations as well, and that's a process that we have to go through. As I mentioned already, it's not a process that's any different from the process that the previous administration went through, and it's also consistent with the European legislation. Of course, if the member has particular suggestions to make about ways in which we can fund future ferry provision, then I'm happy to discuss that with her if she's got a proposal to put forward. But this process, of course, had to take advantage of the fact that the previous contract involved leases for the vessels which currently service those islands, entered into a private arrangement some years ago. The vessels move forward not just to this contract, but to the very end of this contract. So the opportunity, if you wanted to undertake new ferry provision for these islands was not there this time. But if she has a further suggestion to make about future contracts, I'm happy to listen to that.
Thank you. Graham Day.
The Minister indicated that Serco Northlink have improvements planned for the future. Is he able to expand on how the new operators will improve the service delivered to the communities of Orkney and Shetland?
Minister.
Well, I have mentioned, of course, the dry docking arrangements, which are very important to people on the islands. The knowledge that there will not be, for example, a 9-week period when there is disruption to the services, and that's crucial. Beyond that, there is enough scope within the tender that we've agreed with the operator to allow for them to take decisions on a commercial basis, which might lead to the improvement of the service. At the same time, we made very clear to them the need for the continuity and reliability of the service, both in terms of passengers and the freight customers. But there is always, of course, a potential for further improvements. I'm aware that there are some which are being worked on just now, but it really will be for the company to come forward with those improvements when they're ready to make that announcement.
Thank you. Duncan McNeill.
Presiding Officer, can I thank the Minister for a mention in his speech and reminding people I've had a concern about this issue since 2005. Indeed, so much so on that day, for the completeness of record, that we voted against the Minister and my own government that night because they refused to give assurances on the application of TUPE. Since then, of course, we've had the Guruk Dunoon tendered out without the assurance of TUPE. But to get onto the rub of the matter, and the replacement of the contract for the Clyde and Hebridean ferries, which expires, could you give us some assurances? And for those people who work at CalMac headquarters, ticketing operation at Gourock, that they will be protected in this process, again, not as the people involved in the Gourock and Dunoon run. Minister, you don't have to answer that question. If you would like, we'll move on to the next one.
Yes, I would say, Presiding Officer, that obviously Inverclyde is quite a long way from Orkney, but I'm prepared to answer the questions. I think I've laid out the answer to some of the questions that are raised by Duncan McNeill in relation to terms and conditions and trying to protect those. And of course we have an interest in that and we will push that as far as we can. The point I was making before in quoting Duncan McNeill, and I did quote Michael McMahon, but also Des McNulty and others, was the necessity to follow the relevant legislation. And we will do that, but at the same time, well, he didn't. It was tendered and the contract failed shortly afterwards. So can I say that we will look at the question of staff interest? I think I've displayed that already. We'll meet with the trade unions tomorrow, one trade union tomorrow, and other trade unions subsequently. So I think that shows that we're taking that commitment very seriously.
Next question, Angus MacDonald.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. The most salient point from the Minister's statement is that we're still working to the same set of European rules that Labour and the Lib Dems did when in power. Can I ask the Minister to outline how continued investment in ferry services in Scotland will contribute to sustainable economic growth, not just for our island communities, but for the whole of Scotland?
Minister.
Can I say that, first of all, the question raises a very interesting point, because we are often asked, and I'm sure previous administrations were as well, about the fact that the majority of people in Scotland don't live on islands, and they wonder why the government spends the sums of money that I've been talking about supporting the transport needs of what they perceive to be a relatively small number of people. But our investment in ferries does not go just to people, it has wider benefits. Island communities, as we mentioned, are at the forefront of some key industries in Scotland, such as energy, oil and gas and renewables. We've also heard mention from Jane McGregor of the shellfish and other fishing interests as well. Everything from Arran cheese and Islay whisky to Orkney beef and Shetland salmon and tourism. And these may be island businesses, but they support and are supported by networks and supply chains across the nation. In addition, our investments support a large number of jobs, over 1,500 in the ferry operators that provide these subsidised services and more in the ports. So what I've said about supporting these services and also about investing in new vessels for the first time on the Clyde shows that we support these contracts, we support these services to the islands because they also support the rest of Scotland as well.
Elaine Murray, very briefly.
Yeah, thank you, Minister. Can I just refer to your comments, and can I ask you if CalMac, are you telling us that CalMac, which is a subsidiary of a company wholly owned by the Scottish Government, submitted an incompetent bid for the Northland Link contract, and was that the reason for the resignation last week of Archie Robertson, the Chief Executive of David McBrain?
Minister.
Can I say that the resignation of Archie Robertson is really a case, a matter between Archie Robertson and the board of CalMac? And no, I did not say it was an incompetent bid. I just said I hadn't seen the figures which attached to it because it didn't pass the final stage. I wouldn't go any further than that just now, other than to say that for the last time, the ferry service that we've got in the Northern Isles replicates the best elements of what we had before and will further improve them.
Thank you very much. And that concludes question to the Minister. And the next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 3991 in the name of Bruce Crawford on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a business programme. I would ask any member who wishes to speak against the motion to press the request to speak button now. I call on Bruce Crawford to move motion number 3991. Cabinet Secretary. Thank you. As no member has asked to speak against the motion, therefore I will now put the question to the Chamber, which is that motion number 3991 in the name of Bruce Crawford be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed to. The next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 3993 in the name of Bruce Crawford on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a Stage 1 deadline. I would ask any member who wishes to speak against the motion to press the request to speak button now. I'm going to call on Bruce Crawford to move motion number 3993. Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, perhaps for the last time, formally move with a particular flourish.
Many thanks. I certainly regret that it's for the last time. As no member has asked to speak against the motion, therefore I'll now put the question to the Chamber. And the question is that motion number 3993, in the name of Bruce Crawford, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed to. There are no questions to be put as a result of today's business, and we will therefore now move on to members' business. And I would ask members who are leaving the Chamber now to do so quickly and quietly.